Good evening. This is Radio Free Mormon. Tonight, I am joined once again by my esteemed co-counsel, Kolby Reddish, as we're hot on the trail of another chapter of Austin Fife's Light on Truth letter. This chapter that we will cover tonight deals with child sexual abuse in the Mormon Church. To help us go over this chapter is a special guest that I will introduce as soon as we get this show on the road, which we're about to do right now, tonight on Radio Free Mormon. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. This is Radio Free Mormon on the air, broadcasting behind enemy lines. Tonight's episode: child abuse in the Mormon Church. As I say, we are once again back to dissecting Austin Fife's his Light on Truth letter, on the child abuse chapter in the Light on Truth letter. And once again, here is my co-counsel, Kolby Reddish. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Good morning, RFM. How are you?
I always feel cheered when you walk into the courtroom and over to counsel table to sit next to me in one of these episodes.
Wearing my characteristic flannel.
Yes, and just about to get held in contempt by the judge for that flannel, I must say.
I don't wear flannel in court, for what it's worth.
It's been too long since we've been talking about Austin Fife.
We're back.
I think he's missed it.
I am certain he has not.
Okay, well, let me introduce our special guest, who is Elsie Walker. Elsie, how are you doing?
Doing pretty good. How are y'all doing?
Great. Fantastic. Thank you. And I love your y'all. You must be from the South.
I live in Alabama.
The deep South.
Deep South.
Well, welcome to our show. Elsie, can you introduce yourself just a little bit to the audience? First off, can you tell the audience a little bit about you? And I don't want to go into your background just yet. This is a little bit different than what I told you at the top of the show, but just tell us a little bit about who you are. You're from Alabama. Tell us about yourself.
Well, actually, I'm originally from the Washington, D.C. area, and I grew up there. And I married a Navy guy, so where I'm from is basically everywhere in the world, for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm married. I have 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and we just had our 6th great-grandchild. So we're very, very blessed to have that in our lives. You want me to hold off on the background a little bit? So
I will, and it'll be just in a second. We'll get into it. So let me go ahead and explain to the audience what I told you about the structure of the show before we started. The structure of the show is going to be as follows: 3 parts, basically. First off, we're going to find out a little bit about Elsie's background, why it is that she is particularly drawn to this subject. The second is, then we're going to talk about, what is the second part we're going to talk about? I've already forgotten. No, we're going to talk about the story about
line by line. We're going to line by line.
I need to get more sleep between Mormonism After Dark and recording on Saturday mornings for Radio Free Mormon. The second thing, Elsie, is going to be about why it was that you came to be drawn to this letter, the circumstances of why it is. She ended up writing a review, a rather extensive line by line or point by point rebuttal of this chapter in Austin Fife's letter. And that's why it is that she ended up being on the show, because we talked about this. It was been a few months ago. It was January, I think we started talking. And she had written something that was so eloquent, so well done, so analytical, that appealed to my lawyerly sense about this. And I took the time to read it, and I was impressed. And I was telling Elsie last night that this was an unusual show because I had talked to her for the first time after booking her on the show. And I had asked her, remember this, Elsie? I said, do you know why it is you're on the show? And she goes, well, and I said, it's because I read what you wrote. And I was so impressed by what you wrote that I booked you without even talking with you. Now, maybe that wasn't the best move. So don't prove me wrong tonight, okay, Elsie?
I'll try my best.
No pressure. No pressure at all. But if it's okay, and this is very, very sensitive stuff. So by the way, everybody, I should give some kind of a warning. This subject obviously deals with issues of child sex abuse. And that's the warning. So if that's something that you can't or don't want to listen to, leave now, please. because it is going to get pretty intense here in just a few seconds as Elsie starts talking about her story and why it is that she is particularly enmeshed in this issue. Elsie, take it away.
Oh, okay. Well, my story, of course, I was LDS. I was born to LDS parents. And so the only thing I knew was, of course, growing up in the Mormon Church. My parents had converted to Mormonism after yet another child died in our family. And mom was looking for answers, and the Mormon missionaries provided them. And the next thing we know, my parents, of course, I wasn't even born yet, but my parents became members. Throughout my childhood, there was a lot of abuse in the home, even though to the outside world, it looked like we were the perfect LDS family. And part of that abuse was sexual in nature. I often tell people this, my dad was a great guy, except he had this one little flaw in his character, and it was called molesting your daughters. And long story short, I had to deal with the effects of that and the after effects of that for most of my lifetime. And then, of course, along comes some of the LDS teachings from my generation. We used to shorten it down to better dead than defiled. That wasn't exactly what they said. That wasn't the quote, but that's how we used to shorten it down. And so, when it dawned on me in my teenage years that what had happened actually had happened, and wasn't my imagination, wasn't my childhood thoughts, it really did happen. Then I was stuck with the question, why didn't you fight? And I didn't have an answer for that.
Elsie, can you stop for just a second? I really apologize, but there may be some members of the audience who are not Mormon, may not know about the Mormons' rather rigid position on this.
Yes.
If you can explain what that means, and you can include the story about the train station and the body in the box coming back from a mission, that whole story?
Oh, yes. Okay. One of the early leaders of the Mormon Church, when I say early, I mean 1940s, 1950s, made a statement that his family would rather see him come home dead from his mission in a box than alive and defiled sexually. In other words, he had some kind of relationship with a female, and that they would rather see him come home dead. I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the particular quote in front of me.
And Elsie, can I just tell you, I think it was Marion G. Romney, but I just want to emphasize this, is that this is a story that maybe we don't hear that much anymore, but sometimes stories take on a life of their own. And even though this was originally said in 40, it was quoted a lot of times.
Yes.
Thereafter by other general authorities talking about the same or similar subjects. I knew about it in the church, and I joined in 1978, fresh out of high school. I mean, this is one of those things that you hear about, and I heard about. Colby, did you hear about this? Did you know about this story?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Everybody knows about the story in the Mormon Church. Am I wrong, or at least of a certain age?
You're absolutely correct. And for us girls, though, and I don't think that the guys knew this, for us girls, we were told a story that I believe originated with David O. McKay, but I can't vouch for that. And it was an illustrative story of you want to be that beautiful rose on top of the hillside instead of the dusty flower along the side of the road that everybody's kicked dirt on. You want to be that beautiful flower that nobody's touched. And if you're not that beautiful flower, it's basically your fault because you're supposed to fight to the death. Well, nobody ever explained that didn't count if you were a child.
Right. And as a flower, you got to choose where you were planted.
Yeah, really, Yeah. And so these kinds of things play into a young person's mind. And when you're a teenager and you're facing the bishop interview and the whole ball of wax, your whole brain is kind of mashed up and everything. And in my mind, I felt there was no hope. And I actually tried to commit suicide at the age of 15 over this. I would find out years later.
Did anybody know what was going on at the time, or that you were actually trying to commit suicide, or did you cover that up?
I went down and what I did was I did a dumb teenager thing. I took a whole bunch of sinus medication, which doesn't usually kill you, Sudafed, but it will speed up your heart rate. And I went downstairs and I told Mom and Dad, I said, I think I need to go to the hospital because I was chickening out.
Right.
I didn't really want to die. Okay. And so I told them. They took me to the hospital. And I can remember laying on the gurney in the emergency room. And the young doctor looks at me and says, why'd you try to kill yourself? And I couldn't understand for the life of me how he knew that, but he did. And I kept denying it, of course, and said, no, I didn't. After that, I decided if I could, I would just try to prove myself worthy from that point on. And that leads to more frustration, if you don't mind my saying so.
Elsie, can I pause for 1 second and just say there will be people, because RFM and I deal with this every time we do one of these responses. There will be people who will say that, like, this is the large take in Austin Fife's letter, right? Is he's trying to say that these situations happen in the church in spite of the church's teaching and policies rather than because of it. And so I just wanted to highlight that the quote that you were talking about from Marion G. Romney, you were right, RFM, is he said explicitly, so this is the direct quote so that we're not paraphrasing it, better dead clean than alive unclean. And then he finished that by telling the story about the train station and said, remember this, my son, we would rather come to the station and take your body off that train in a casket than have you come home unclean, having lost your virtue. So I just want to get that there established in the record, because there will be people who will listen to this who will try to delegitimize your story. And I want to push back on that and say, listen to those quotes and think about how those quotes are going to hit someone at the age of 14 and 15 while they're dealing with this situation. That's the reality of the church's teachings, and the reality that the church leaders say so many things without, it seems, any care for how those things are going to hit people who are on the margins or who are on the edges or who are going through a situation they should have never had to grapple with while they're growing up inside of the church. And I think this will kind of be a theme throughout the course of today's episode. There's the initial trauma that happens from abuse, but the way the church handles these situations, including the way it handled this situation with you, is a level of secondary abuse from people who are supposed to be speaking for God and supposed to be protecting the children in their care. And instead, they oftentimes make these situations worse. Do I think that's the intent of these church leaders? No, I don't. But we don't just measure people's effect in the world by their intent. We measure it by their intent and the effect that they cause. And I think that's the big problem we're going to focus on today, is the effect they cause. And I'm so sorry that those effects affected you in the way that they did, as I am listening to your story.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, and I'm not alone. Since leaving the LDS Church many, many, many years ago, I have come across other kids that I knew growing up, and now they are adults. And now they are a little more, willing to talk to me personally. I haven't met any willing to go on your show, RFM. I'm sorry. I told you about the one guy yesterday, the one guy who's gay, and what happened with him. And I asked him, would he like to go on a show? And he said, no, I don't think so. And okay, you don't press that. But the fact of the matter is that it's not that unusual. Sad to say, it's not that unusual. What is unusual is somebody speaking out and saying, this happened to me. Even if they're disclosing to one or two individuals as adults, that's actually quite unusual. But I have spoken with quite a few people that I grew up with in the ward I grew up in, who were going through some horrific things at home. It may not have been sexual abuse in every case, but there was enough that like this one young lady, her older sister was dating a guy, and she told the boy to have sex with little sister. And he forced himself on the little girl at the age of 8 on a regular basis. And when she tried to get help from the bishop, it was a no-go. He didn't believe her. So what do you do? And part of the problem with this, and at least it was for me, and I'm just going to throw this out there, we may cover it later, I don't know. every time it involves somebody who's deemed worthy, a worthy elder, a worthy bishop, that thought that they have worthiness and authority makes you wonder if the problem isn't you. What did I do to get that person to do these things to me? As a little girl, I didn't realize what was happening was wrong. I didn't understand that till I got older. And in a lot of cases, the kids don't understand. But at some point, you start wondering, what did I do? So there's a lot of guilt that gets heaped on these individuals.
Elsie, can I ask you, Colby's here on the show. He's not just the sidekick. He's also has a very intense involvement in this kind of issue as well. Are you familiar with Colby's background, Elsie?
Not at all.
Elsie, Colby, can you give us a thumbnail of that?
I can do that now. I actually was planning on doing that a little bit later. Would you like me to do it now?
How about now? It's organic.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
So, Elsie, my sitting bishop in 2021 was charged with and admitted to, pleaded guilty to child sex abuse crimes starting. So he was a sitting bishop that was abusing children, and the abuse dated back over 10 years, starting when the children were about 7 or 8 years old. A little bit later, we'll have some documentation from the police reports and some local reporting on that. But that basically started me looking at this issue and realizing that the church has just a really unhealthy handling of these situations. Yes. To return back to kind of the thrust of Austin Fife's Light and Truth letter, he says that his basic take is that because abuse happens everywhere, or it happens at greater levels other places, that apparently he thinks that exculpates the church bewilderingly to me. Mm-hmm. I think what my local situation showed me, or helped showed me, is that the church's policies at a systemic level on handling this issue are broken. In fact, I'll conclude the episode with 3 policy change suggestions that I dared to write to Salt Lake before getting a blow-off letter a few days before the Arizona Bisby case was broken. And so when this local situation happened in early 2022, I'm sorry, RFM, you're muted.
A few days before the Bisby case story exploded, you got the response, the blow-off letter from Salt Lake?
That's correct. So it was a Saturday that I received this letter after months of waiting, and the letter that we wrote to President Nelson, which we were told by the Area 70, because we were working with, I'm sorry, I said Area 70, the area president. We were working with the area president and the stake president after we appeared on Mormon Stories. So my wife and I appeared on Mormon Stories in February of 2022, and we told this story. We told the story about how our ward and subsequent leaders basically rallied around the child abuser. The elders and high priests in the ward, I'm not kidding you, were taking this individual out to dinner every Tuesday night until he was until he went to formally serve his time, which is, again, bewildering to me. I definitely understand, wanting to comfort people in prison, go to visit people in prison. But for this particular crime, I think that's where I personally would draw the line, especially when the individual is taking no accountability. Anyways, as a result
of that, take a pedophile out to dinner, Colby?
No, I wouldn't.
That's not very Christ-like of you.
In fact, I even told my brothers because I have 2 brothers and both Exmo now. And I told my brothers when this came out, I was just kind of sharing the way people in the ward were handling it. I said, I know you would never do this, but because I was at the time, I was the only one of us that had children. And I said, I know that you would never do this, but if any one of you ever touches my children like that, it would be mercy for me to let you walk away, let alone take you out to dinner or something. I remember sending a text like that when I was super angry about how the situation was being handled. So because of the way it was being handled, my wife and I appear on Mormon Stories. And I'll say this to the stake president's credit. After the stake president saw the Mormon Stories episode, I was really worried he was going to call me a liar or double down. He didn't. And instead, he did meet with us repeatedly with the area president to try and fix the policies that led to the situation, basically. And we did that for months. We met with him, I think 3 or 4 times over the course of a couple months. And so as we were having these conversations, at one point, the area president basically said, we can't change certain policies. Those can only be changed at Salt Lake. And we've talked to them about you. We've talked to them about your situation. So we'd like to ask you to write a letter to Salt Lake that kind of outlines your concerns and the policy change suggestions you have. My background, Elsie, professionally, is I'm a lawyer like RFM. And at the time, I was coming off of just having been a county prosecutor that had started to prosecute some of these cases. And so I knew how problematic the way the church was handling it from a victim's rights, from a survivor's rights standpoint was. And that's why I was concerned about it. So it was as a result of those meetings with the area president and the stake president that we wrote this letter to Salt Lake, received this blow off the Saturday before the Monday where Mike Resendez dropped the Arizona Bisby case news. And that's where I just decided the church has no interest in fixing this issue when this is happening over and over and over again. And I'm getting a blow-off letter from Salt Lake after being told that they were expecting my letter at the highest levels of the church. And this is what I receive. I just decided I can no longer lend my name nor my family's name to this organization or this institution any longer, because there is some truth to what Austin Fife is saying on the end of abuse does happen everywhere. Abuse does happen in homes, but that does not excuse.
The problem with that argument is that the Mormon Church has put itself up on a high pedestal. Nobody stuck them on that pedestal. When they say they are the one true church, that basically says everything else is not true, and they've got all the truth and nobody else does. We're up here on this high pedestal.
Right.
Well, hey, you know what? If you're going to stand on the pedestal like that, be prepared to live up to the standards you put on yourself. Nobody put that on them.
Absolutely.
That's what they're missing.
Right. And to be clear, I'm sorry, Colby, just to be very clear, and I know you're not saying this, but once again, for anybody who might be prone to misconstrue, what we're not saying is that the LDS church can't be the one and only true church unless they have zero incidents of child abuse that are church related or on church properties or church functions. What we're saying is they need to do more than just say they have the gold standard.
Right.
To protect children. They actually need to have the gold standard.
Yes, and the phrase Elsie just used, which is it's how you handle it, that's what I realized is, yes, no one can hold the standard to the church of no church member or no church leader is ever going to abuse. Right. I wish we could, but we're not able to do that at any level of any institution, frankly. Right. And so that's where the question then to me becomes, but do the church's statements about the way it handles these cases hold up under scrutiny? And how does it handle these cases when they happen? And my review of now hundreds of these cases, because after I appeared on Mormon Stories, one of the things I wasn't prepared for, similar it sounds like to your experience, LC, is I received hundreds of emails from people who connected with the way my wife and I told this story and wanted to be heard. I remember receiving a 90-page letter from someone in their 80s who told me their entire life story and how this affected their life for the rest of their life. It affected their children. It affected their grandchildren. And that's the other thing that's just makes me so infuriated at people like Austin Fife and Jennifer Roach, who does the apologetics that he recycles in this chapter of this book, is they seem to bear no recognition of the cost that these survivors pay, not just for the immediate trauma, but for the secondary trauma and for the trauma it affects them for the rest of their life. And that's where I was left reviewing this chapter last night as I was preparing for today's episode. I'm left with this question of, are you basically saying, Austin, that like a minimal level of abuse is okay, and that the way the church handles it in these minimal level abuse cases is okay? Because that's the implication of the arguments that he's making. And I think that's
both of them. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm a little more surprised at Miss Roach because she's been on the receiving end of abuse. Remember her background story, if you're familiar with it, is that she was 15 years old. Her father had just passed away. She was very traumatized, very vulnerable. And this evangelical doofhead comes in and takes advantage of that. At 15, you're still somewhat limited in how you process things. So he was very, very wrong in doing it. And she is looking at this from maybe a different angle, but it's not a beneficial angle. I've had to actually, not had to, I've volunteered in the past to counsel with people who have been adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And I was telling RFM that it's hard with the women, it's harder with the men, because you see what they go through. And I think it's harder for men to process it. And I was, in all honesty, very shocked at some of the conclusions Miss Roach drew, because as a therapist, I thought she'd know better. I'll credit her with her education. I'll give her, 3 thumbs up for pulling herself through all of that and coming forward in the media. I have no problems with her having done any of those things. What I have a problem with is what I see her doing, and I see Mr. Fife mimicking, is basically excusing everything and coming up with reasons why theirs is better than anybody else's. And you can't tell that to someone who's been through all those things. RFM, you did ask for me to explain how I ended up getting involved in this, and I should do that quickly. I was on Facebook, and I knew a fellow named Fred Anson, and he had put out a call for, different people to write about different portions of this. Now, I had never seen
Of the Austin Fife Light on
of
Truth
the
letter?
Austin Fife letter. Yes.
Yeah.
And I had never read it before. And I said, well, okay. And I signed up for a few things. And this was one of the things I signed up for, never having read it, not knowing a thing about Mr. Fife, nothing. Okay. I go and I read this, and I was dumbfounded, to be honest with you. I wasn't expecting it to be like that.
That's the usual effect, Elsie.
It really, it surprised me. And
That
there
feeling,
were
Elsie, that feeling's the Holy Ghost testifying to you that it's true, in case you didn't know.
it's the holy great grandma. Okay. And so, it's bad enough when you're a mama. It's worse when you're a grandma, and don't even mess with great grandma. Okay. We have a bigger skillet than everybody else. The thing that got me, though, the most, I think, in this whole mishmash of what Mr. Fife wrote was that he seemed to extract himself from what was going on. It was almost like he was writing it from a distance. And I couldn't quite understand why he would do that. Then I started tracking down things that Mrs. Roach, or Miss Roach Lee, I should say, said and did, some of her interviews online and different shows she did, and things that she wrote. Well, she actually wrote one for FAIR, and I read that. And I'm sitting here thinking, I'm not a trained therapist. I didn't go to college to do this. Okay. But I've done it over the years as part of just caring about people and being part of support group type situations. There is no way in God's little green earth I would try to tell people some of the things that you're reading in this letter. And I'm honestly wondering if Mr. Fife just really doesn't sit down and talk to anybody. If I could say one thing to him right this minute, it'd be, Mr. Fife, please talk with us. I would love to talk with Mr. Fife. I'd love to be able to talk with him as somebody who's come through it. I stayed LDS for a long time. The LDS church became what I went to try and prove myself worthy to God. That's what I was doing there the whole time, trying to make myself worthy all over again. It doesn't work that way. Okay. But I was trying. And Mr. Fife has an obligation. Now that he's written this, he has an obligation to listen to the rest of us who've been through it. And Miss Roach has been through it, but she was an older girl. That's not to diminish it now. But try telling the 5-year-old that a 15-year-old gets it. 15-year-old don't get it. Not unless they've been through it at 5. So there is a distinction there. It's not a pleasant distinction, I will say, but a distinction. So he owes it. I'll just say he actually, now that he's spoken out like this, he kind of owes it to those who've been through it. And that's why I told Fred, yes, I'm not only going to write it for you, and I gave him a short version. I went on and wrote the long version that you referenced earlier. I care about this. I'm doing fine. I've come through it. I'm on the other side of it. I can see it a little more, introspectively and from a distance as well. But there are a lot of people who aren't. And I talk to them fairly regularly. And I can't imagine that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints doesn't know. And they owe it to these people to listen to them. It's their policies and procedures that have caused this problem. So anyway, that's how I ended up doing this.
Wow. Thank you, Elsie. We're going to get to the letter here in just a second. I just wanted to observe something interesting about Colby and this entire project that we're involved in. Correct me if I'm wrong, Colby. I believe this is the one chapter that Colby wanted to address in this entire Light on Truth letter. And somehow he got roped into doing the whole thing. Is that true, Colby? Did I remember that right?
Bless your heart.
That is more or less accurate, RFM. Yep.
So there's no way when I was planning this with Elsie after I read what she wrote, which was really, really good,
right?
That I couldn't reach out to Colby and say, Colby, you got to be a part of this.
And thank you for the invitation. And I love your comments so far, Elsie. They're just connecting so much with what I've observed. Having spoken out about this, I think I was unprepared for how much it happens to people and how much it affects them for the rest of their lives. Just to kind of finish that thought of, at one point I was collecting email and I didn't make myself easy to find after Mormon Stories. My Facebook account isn't linked to my last name. I didn't put my email out there publicly, but at one point I had over 400 emails saved in a folder that people had sent me telling their personal story, because there are people who want these stories to be heard. And that's where, exactly like you invited Mr. Fife or the church, Elsie, to hear these stories, I will make that same invitation. Like, I am happy to forward those stories with the permission of the people who shared them with me to people who actually want to use them to make the church a better, safer place. This is a conversation that has needed to happen over and over and over again, and the church cannot keep dodging it. There are headlines in the news almost every week about how the church has failed another child. And I just think about the follow-on effects of that, how it fails that person, and then that person is dealing with that trauma and grappling with that trauma for the rest of their lives. And oftentimes it can be passed down from generations of people are affected by this, all because the church won't admit that they're wrong and admit that they need to make changes. And it's because of people like Roach and Austin Fife who carry their water for them and don't allow them to be accountable for the things they say, that I'm just so, there's no moment when I'm talking about things in the church, to your point, RFM, than this one, that I feel more justified in flipping over the tables and making a whip and a scourge than talking about this issue. Because if the Jesus I believed in existed, he would demand action on this.
Well, Fife actually quotes Jesus when he talks about, it'd be better if somebody offends one of the little ones, it'd be better if they had a millstone tied around their neck and throw it into the depths of the sea. Well, do you believe that, Mr. Fife, or don't you?
No, it's a question, isn't it? Whether you quote it because you believe it or you quote it to show your virtue, which is lacking in the rest of the article. So let's go ahead. We'll get to some of these comments here. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the letter. And by the way, so everybody knows, this is going to follow this chapter, Abuse in the Church. Now, Austin Fife did not number his chapters. If he had, it might have been a little easier for me to reference them, but it's the one called Abuse in the Church. And Questions and Concerns, that's the way I think he titles all of his chapters. And I was going to simply go with your quotes, because what Elsie had done is she had made all these quotes, about 11, well, actually quite a few of them, with her responses to them. It's very detailed and very thoughtful. The thing that she wrote, the essay she wrote, the paper she wrote. And I based this order of things off of your paper, Elsie, hopefully to make it flow better for you. Let me show you the first slide, okay? This is the first slide. And what I did for each of these was I took the quoted part, put it on the left side so you can read it. And then on the right side, I actually went to an awful lot of extra work to reproduce the page of the chapter together with the underlining of the part that's being quoted on the left. And the only reason I went to all that extra work was so that people would know that we are actually quoting correctly and directly from the Abuse in the Church chapter of Austin Fife's Light on Truth letter. So they can know that, and they can rest assured, and that if for whatever reason in the future, the wording of this letter and this chapter should change, then we've got it documented the way it was as of April 12th, 2025, when we're recording this. So here's the first one. You ready to go, Elsie and Colby?
Can I pause you there for a second?
go ahead.
And just ask RFM. So are you saying that you care about correctly attributing to Austin Fife the words that Austin Fife actually wrote, and that maybe based on our past experience where he's changed his letter in response to certain things we've said, you want people to be able to see the version we originally responded to?
Well, yes, because, what would happen if we just quoted it and then he changed it later on, and then people would say, hey, you misquoted him.
Right. And also that you're correctly attributing to Austin the things that Austin has said, and maybe not that other people have said. I'm just highlighting maybe the difference.
Jacob Hansen dig?
No, I'm
You've
just
got Jacob Hansen on the brain, don't you?
No, I'm just maybe highlighting the difference in your editorial approach or our editorial approach versus other people's. That's all.
Other people whose name rhymes with Jacob Hansen?
I didn't say that.
Okay. So here's this. I'm glad you put that in there, Colby. Abuse in the church. Here's the first one. Ready, Elsie? We'll let Elsie go first on each of these, okay, since we're really following her paper. And then Colby can throw in, and I'll make some extraneous comment.
Great.
Number one, my intuition. This is Austin Fife writing in his Light on Truth letter. My intuition led me to believe that because of the practices and beliefs of the church, it was likely safer to be a church member than not. Was I wrong?
Well,
what do you think, Elsie?
My first response to him, be a church member as opposed to not being a church member? Exactly what are you trying to tell us? And the other thing is, well, maybe you might be, maybe your wife might be, but the question is, what about the children? I think that's the question. It has nothing to do with his safety. He's a grown adult. He's not asking about the children.
Maybe that's what he means in the context, and it's inartfully worded. Austin has done that before. But
he needs to clarify.
You know what the first thought was that came to me when I read this, Elsie? It was, he says, my intuition led me to believe that because of the practices and beliefs of the church, it was likely safer to be a church member than not. Excuse me. I mean, you could say the same thing about the Catholic Church.
You could.
Their practices and beliefs in the Catholic Church are not actually that molesting kids is okay.
Right.
That's not part of their doctrine. It's in spite of that doctrine, and in spite of the idea that, doing what the Lord commands is important in the Catholic Church, and, staying away from little kids is part of that. That's not the issue. The issue is how it is that this commandment can be broken by people who want to break the commandment, who are in positions of authority over children in the Catholic Church. And it's the exact same thing. So,
and if the policy is to whitewash it, transfer them, not report it to authorities, which, by the way, since you brought up the Catholic Church, you do know that both the Catholic Church, the LDS Church, and a few other smaller groups do not require mandated reporting. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Right, the J-Dubs. Jehovah's Witnesses?
You're hinting
well, them and some independent fundamental Baptists. Yeah.
Yes.
The Southern Baptist Convention does require pastors and people who work with youth to be mandated reporters. So
and that's what you're a member of. So you have an expertise in that, definitely.
Yeah. And Methodist Church also, all of your mainline churches, from what I understand, are mainline Protestant churches, I should clarify, are requiring that at least one person in the congregation be a mandated reporter. Usually it's the pastor or assistant or youth pastor. In the church I go to, it's the pastor, the youth pastor, and the head of children's Sunday school. So,
and the idea, as I understand it behind this, then we'll get to you, Colby, is that regardless of what the law is, what the LDS Church tends to do is say, we will do as much as the law requires and no more.
Mhm.
And sometimes they actually do worse than that, like the Bisby case, right?
Yeah.
But typically they're trying to do the least amount that is legally required. And what
They
you're
are.
saying is that within these other denominations, they have said, well, we don't care, or I should say, irrespective of what the law says,
Right.
we are going to have a policy in our church that this person, like the bishop or the pastor, you're a mandatory reporter.
Mhm.
So if you don't do that, even if it's legal for you to not report, but if you don't report, then you're not going to be a pastor anymore.
You're going to lose it. Yeah.
Well, and moreover, the problem that solves by those groups having a clearly established policy of we report abuse means that there is no confidential clergy penitent privilege that attaches to those confessions. Because part of the test in every state that I've looked at for those, again, optional mandatory reporting exemptions are that it has to be a confidential communication. And so if the church were to just literally change that one policy and say, in instances of child abuse, we believe in being mandated reporters all of the time, because there is not a single U.S. state or territory or jurisdiction that I'm aware of that prohibits reporting. It's just there are these optional mandatory reporting exemptions. And if the church were to change that policy alone, and I'll just say, I'll drive this point home when we get as applied to the Bisby case, because we're going to look at that actual order that went out from the judge to really make this point. But my point is, if the church wanted to change this, they could change it tomorrow by changing a line in that damn handbook that says we report abuse every single time. People no longer have a reasonable expectation that those confessions are going to be kept confidential. And now there is no issue with the law. There is no privilege that attaches ever. And the church could solve that tomorrow, and they don't.
Well, and their expert, Jennifer Roach-Lee, she is not exactly pro-mandated reporting. She argues in some instances in some of her writings against it, believing that it, and he actually cites one instance having to do with nurses and people in hospitals. It makes no application sense. But she argues against it. And I'm not sure that she realizes, because the argument, I think Fife may actually parrot this, is that it doesn't prevent abuse. It prevents the next incidence of abuse. You may not be able to stop the initial abuse, but you can stop it from happening continuously, and you can stop it from happening to another child. That's what mandated reporting is for.
Yes. And
It's
to the
not
same
there
child
to
again.
prevent abuse.
I'm sorry, you were saying, I was just adding, you're saying it prevent it from happening to another child,
Right.
and prevent it from happening to the same child again.
Over and over. So it's to stop the abuse. It's not prevention, it's stopping the abuse.
Well, the other thing I would say about that is, so we have these policies and we have these laws, but beyond the policies and laws, there are also this is similar to like the idea of genetics and epigenetics, where the culture that we have is informed by the laws and policies we have. And if we have a very clear policy of mandated reporting, it can help in edge cases send a message that we as a society, or we as a church, or we as a culture and community, we do not tolerate this situation. And it makes it a lot harder for people to find themselves in positions like that happen in my local situation, where people bewilderingly are ending up sitting there defending a pedophile, defending a child abuser, because they get lost in the weeds of all these different things that they've got to keep inside of their head. So I also want to highlight that even if we couldn't point to cases where mandated reporting has directly stopped abuse or even prevented abuse, it also helps send a message to people who have this proclivity that it is not tolerated, period. And that makes it a lot less likely, at least in my mind that looks at the way people may be thinking, to happen in the future. It's sending a clear message that can often have follow-on effects just that extend beyond the policy, is my point.
Correct.
Yeah. And, here's the thing. As a defense attorney, 35 years, criminal law, the thing is that these guys don't operate in a vacuum. Most of them are guys. They don't operate in a vacuum. They know what's what. They know where the ripings are, or the pickings are ripe. They know where the field is white and all ready to harvest. They know where there are situations that are more able to be manipulated to their benefit. And the Mormon Church is one of them. And right now, the Methodist Church and that Southern Convention Baptist Church, that you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
if you've
SBC.
got an absolute doctrine that says that any such report will be communicated to the police, mandatory reporting, then you're making that church less attractive
Correct.
to a child molester, and they will try and move along to some place. It sounds horrible, and
We're
I
going to
know,
be
and it
covering
is.
some of that, I think, later on when we go to those 7 points.
Yes. And I just want
And
to say,
I
I know it
think,
sounds horrible, and it is, but it's the truth that they will
Mhm.
move on to a place where they are better able to get access to children. So unfortunately, it's not a matter of stopping them unless they actually get, reported and turned into
I want to
the
throw
authorities.
something
But
else out.
I'm just
I
saying,
want
keeping them out of the flock, mandatory
to,
reporting is a method of helping that happen.
well, I want to throw something else out too. I've been in, as you can imagine, because of our traveling, quite a few churches, and I have watched since the late, I'd say the late 90s, probably 97 on, churches starting to do one preventative thing that I think is really good. And I actually was a volunteer doing this, where they have cameras in every single classroom, and not in the bathrooms, but outside the
Right.
bathrooms, and in the different areas of the church that might be a place that a person could take a child to. And these cameras are on whenever there's people present in the church. I've actually sat and looked at multiple screens in one of the many big First Baptist churches we went to. They had, what was it, 3 computers with 112 screens. And I monitored each one of those every single Sunday morning. And I can tell you, more and more churches have gone to that. Even small churches are going to it. Why the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints doesn't do it, I don't know.
And this
But
is
they
good that you
could.
bring this up. This is good that you bring up this up, Elsie, because it gives concrete and reasonable and somewhat obvious when you stop and think about it solutions to this problem. Now, they're not
Mhm.
100% solutions, right? You still need to have 2 people if you're going to go in the bathroom with a primary kid, 2 teachers or whatever, and it's hard to do that because they're so understaffed famously in
Well,
primary, but that's
actually,
still part of it.
churches are getting away from that too. Now they have little buzzers. I attend a very small church. I think on a good Sunday we maybe have 75 people. Okay, that's a small Southern Baptist church. And the parents of preschoolers and the little toddlers and all, kids who can't potty by themselves,
Mhm.
those parents are given a buzz on their cell phone. Your kid has to go potty, and the
Boom,
parents come and take them.
boom.
That's what technology is doing to protect children in churches, and churches are using it. Not too long ago, a little boy in our church, we had a big outside activity. Something happened. I don't know what. I didn't go and talk to the pastor about it, but the little boy went to his parents, said somebody touched him inappropriately. The pastor said, "Where did it happen?" They went and they looked. He scoured through the video
Mhm.
footage and was able to find the incident and turn it over to police. The Mormon Church can do it if a little independent church of 75 people can do it.
Right. And so you got the idea of cameras, and cameras are getting to be so inexpensive nowadays.
Oh,
Of course, you
yeah.
juxtapose that with, the billions and billions and hundreds of billions the church has. They could afford a few cameras. There are also churches that have windows in every
Yep.
door instead of
Windows in
having a
each
solid
door.
door. And,
Mhm.
the frosted windows that the LDS chapels have on the outside, so you
You
can't
can't
see in from the
see in.
outside. When the door's closed, obviously you can't
Right.
see in from the hallway. It's completely
Yeah.
private. So that's another way of taking care of that issue because these things proliferate in privacy, right? Obviously. So
Well,
you make it so there's
it's
no
a
private
crime of
place in the church.
opportunity. It's a
Yes.
crime of opportunity is what it is. They're not going to pick the kid who is, strong, secure, unavailable.
Hmm.
They're going to pick the kid that they view as weak and more likely willing to go along and available.
Hmm.
That's why there's so much incest that goes on in the Mormon Church. That's a whole other discussion, I
Hmm.
guess.
I think that's
But
such a good point, though, Elsie, that I want to underline there, which is the people who do these activities to children, the people who have that proclivity. They know how to determine which kid is like has their parents have more on their plate, or they have too many kids, or they're not paying attention, or they are a kid that maybe already has emotional struggles. Like, they know which kids to pick and do this to. And like, we hear that from people who are survivors of abuse over and over and over again. And I just want to highlight again that when that is the case, and we know that that is the case, studies show that that is the case, then the secondary trauma of having your community basically facilitate, not actively support, I think that's very rarely, but facilitate and at least tolerate this abuse, becomes so much more damaging for those children who are already often grappling with things well beyond what most children grapple with.
Right. Let me just say here, and we're going to go to the next slide because we're going to have to start clipping through these. We're 50 minutes in, but I think it's a fascinating discussion, Elsie, and thank you for being here with us for that. But what we're talking about is simple things the church could do, and things that give the lie to this entire chapter, because the entire chapter is devoted to the idea that the status quo of the LDS church is just fine. Thank you very much. We don't need to be changing anything. So when he asks the question, which he does, and which is quoted here, my intuition led me to believe that because of the practices and beliefs of the church, it was likely safer to be a church member than not. Let's take away all the truth claims, okay, of the Mormon Church being the one and only for this purpose, and the Methodist being the apostate church, and the Southern Baptist being worse than that. Okay, let's just talk about buildings and churches. Austin, do you believe it is safer to send your child to a church where your child is going to be taught or supervised by an adult apart from you? Is that going to be safer with rooms that have doors and frosted windows? Is that going to be safer, or is it going to be safer if there are cameras in the rooms, or is it going to be safer if there are big windows in the door so it's not private? The answer to that, to me, seems obvious. That of course it's going to be safer to send your kids or anybody's kids to a place where there's less privacy in the rooms, as is afforded in the Mormon chapels. So right there is a very obvious example of why it is that I think it's wrong for you to try and be going to bat for the Mormon Church to say that the way they're doing things now is fine and they don't need to improve. All right, so let's go to the next one. Am I more likely, number 2, am I more likely to commit acts of abuse as a member of the church? Austin Fife actually asked this question. It may be for rhetorical effect. It may fall flat. What do you think, Elsie?
Well, okay. Locking down an answer to that question is like nailing Jell-O to a wall. Okay. Because he goes on and he says, is there something in our handbook, rituals, doctrine, or ordinances that inspires violence? Well, given that they keep changing the handbook, rituals, doctrines, or ordinances, it's hard to know if it inspires this or not. Some early stuff, well, prime example, he uses the word violence, so we'll go with that. I went through the temple back in the days, and you did too, I think, off RFM, where you pantomime the blood oath.
And what I was writing down. Go ahead, Elsie, take it.
I read your mind. It's a dangerous place. Where you have the blood oaths, and I'm sorry, that's violence. Yeah. It encourages violence. It was like, done.
Austin, is there something in our handbook, doctrine, ritual, or ordinances that inspires violence? I don't know, Austin. Do you think so?
The handbooks that used to be passed out, my brothers used to get them, would tell boys to do things like tie their hands to the bed so they don't masturbate. Yes. It's kinky, potentially violent, possibly.
That's why there's so many ambidextrous Mormon men.
Yeah, I mean, really. How about this one, though? Let's go into doctrine a little here. What about the conception of Jesus? This earthly conception. It's Mormon doctrine, right? Mary, his spirit sister from the pre-existence, but his earthly physical mother, had some kind of relationship with God, her father, her heavenly father, right? Who has a body of flesh and bone, as tangible as man's. So what are we really talking about here?
We're talking about that for this particular instance. He not only had a he not only had a body of flesh and bone, he had a body of flesh and boner.
I was waiting for something serious to come out of your
That's what Brigham Young taught.
Well,
And
essentially,
it's what many
yes.
Mormons still believe, Elsie. You know that.
Mm-hmm. And the thing of it is it's never directly said God the Father had sex with his daughter to create Jesus. It's never worded that way. It's always worded in this nice little,
Mhm.
do. But
It's
let's
worded
put
in
it.
the way that says most frequently that God sired Jesus Christ, sired the physical body of Jesus Christ, not in
The normal, natural way.
Yeah, it'll end up with that, not in violation of natural law, but in conformity therewith.
Mm-hmm.
And that Jesus was conceived in the same way that everybody else is.
Now, could that inspire such behavior in grown men? Well, okay, depends, I guess, on how you say incest. But Joseph Smith married a mother-daughter team, and I think once you marry the mother, doesn't the daughter become your stepdaughter?
Well, even beyond that, he married. I'm trying to think of the precise example, but there were multiple times he married, live-in maids or people with who he had this like surrogate parent relationship.
Right.
So one of my ancestors is Fanny Alger, one
Oh.
perfect example of that. And the way I learned that, by the way, Elsie, I was in the generation that was taught that Joseph Smith explicitly was not a polygamist. Like I was taught that in a seminary. I was taught that on my mission, and it wasn't until I returned home from my mission and I got an email from Family Search of all places telling me, it was like on some significant day in church history, telling me about people in church history that I was related to. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. I'm clicking on it and I see Joseph Smith on the list. And I'm like, what in the world? How am I related to Joseph Smith? Well, I was related to Joseph Smith by marriage through Fanny Alger, who's like my 5th or 6th great grandmother back on my mom's side.
Oh, so you're the missing link. You're the descendant. You're the love child.
I don't think I have enough charisma to be Joseph Smith's love child.
No, what it is, you got a lot of charisma. Let me tell you that, pal. Don't sell yourself short. But what you're saying is, so you're not directed by blood. You're not related by blood to Joseph Smith, but by marriage, a prior marriage.
Exactly. That's the
Fanny.
way I had it.
Okay. Well, cool.
Well,
so those people think.
My point was, that's how I learned that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. Then I went and read the essay on Joseph Smith being a polygamist. It wasn't until that day that I learned that Joseph Smith was a polygamist.
Oh my gosh.
in our, I guess maybe it was different being raised outside of Utah. I don't know, but we weren't told about it as children, but as teenagers we were. And it was very much directed in seminary class on church history. We had seminary history thing on church history for seminary, and it was a very directed kind of discussion. And we were told that the reason they practiced polygamy is because there were too many women and not enough men. Someone had to take care of the women.
That's what I was told.
And I was hit with those same apologetics, but for some reason I was taught that didn't start until Brigham Young, until the Utah period.
Right, and it usually does, right? Because of all the Missouri persecutions and the 500 or so men being taken away for the Mormon battalion, and so obviously you've got to stock up on women.
Let's stock up on those. Okay.
But yes, that's what we were told. That's what Colby was told. That's what everybody was told. And then finally, some smart person, I don't know who it is, I'm sorry, went back and actually counted the numbers and said, well, actually, there weren't more women than men. There were more men than women.
It might have been the Tanners that did that one.
They were brilliant, and they did a lot of exceptional work.
Fantastic.
So let's go to the next one, if that's okay. Number 3, quote from Austin Fife from his Light on Truth letter. Quote, is there something in our handbook doctrine, rituals, or ordinances that inspires violence? We may have gone over that already.
Mm-hmm.
See, I underlined the next line separately because you address it separately in your wonderful paper, Elsie.
Well,
Number 4, I hate to say this is the case. Once again, Austin Fife speaking or writing. I hate to say this is the case, but any large organization will have some levels of abuse. And the Church of Jesus Christ is no exception. There I have it underlined on the right. What are your thoughts about that, Elsie?
Well, I think I mentioned it before that if you're going to put yourself up on that big pedestal of being the only one, the top dog, once you make yourself the top dog, the model, the mold, the thing everyone should aspire to,
The
let
model,
alone
the
join.
paragon of virtue.
Yeah. Well, once you put yourself up on that, you got to live up to it. It doesn't mean everybody, like Colby said, it doesn't mean everybody's going to, but it does mean how you handle the problems should measure up to what your claims are in terms of being the paragon of virtue.
Hmm.
And to be honest, it doesn't. It's I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, and so tell me if I am, but I actually took their class online, a half-hour class,
And when you say there, you mean the
the
LDS
LDS
church's class?
class on preventing child abuse. Yeah, a half-hour long. I And then just to be sure I knew what I was talking about, I turned around and took classes from several other religious groups. I spent a whole day seeing what all these different groups were doing and comparing it to the Mormon Church. And I do have you're right, I have a write up in there. I compare them to the group I'm most familiar with, which is the Southern Baptist Convention. The Mormon Church has so much money that they could put into something much better than what they've got. What they've got, can I say this? Sucks.
Yeah, tell us about this Protecting Children and Youth video, which is required of all leaders and teachers of children or youth to complete this training within 1 month of being called and every 3 years thereafter. Tell us your thoughts about this video by the church.
Well, it started out, I was thinking, it was cartoons, it was drawings, it wasn't people talking, it wasn't somebody with an authority talking other than the baby bird story that they tell in the beginning,
Yeah.
which Boyd K. Packer talking about nestlings and the snake that eats the birds and all this. It was crazy.
Right. I was going to play it, but I thought I might get into a copyright strike there. But it's a
Yeah,
story that Boyd K.
it's
Packer had told, and that they illustrate with animation. And he's talking about the nestlings, the little birds in the nest, in the house, in the yard where he lived at some point, and how the birds would have these little eggs and they'd hatch and they have nestlings. And I remember that word especially because Elsie keeps focusing on that word nestling. Why do you keep focusing on that word nestling,
because it
Elsie?
reminds me of Nestle's Quick.
Ah, okay. And it's also kind of an odd word. I mean, they're
It's a
baby birds,
weird
whatever,
word.
but they're nestlings. So he's likening them, I think, to the children in the church who have to be protected, right? And
Yeah.
there's a cat that comes around and can't get up there. And I have no idea why this cat
Why the
can't
cat's
get up
trying
there.
to climb a wall, I don't know.
That cat could get up there to that tree. Any place there's a nest, a cat can get to. Okay, I'm just saying on a tree. So, but the cat's walking around at the bottom, and everybody's worried about the cat. And while they're worried about the cat, a snake comes in and eats all the nestlings. The
Yeah,
snake was having a nestling craving,
yeah.
and then they see the snake slithering off with the 3 lumps in it, which represent the recently consumed nestlings. And then he gives the ominous statement, you're not safe anywhere. I think he
We
says words
must
like that.
protect our nestlings. And it shows a little girl in her own house on a cell phone. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay. What is this? It goes further though than that. That's just what I call the ridiculous beginning.
Why is
It
it
only
ridiculous? Tell us.
Well, aside from the fact that children aren't birds, and that's such an old archaic way of expressing it, it's the idea that you can address this issue with animation, or should. I've seen it done. I've seen it on YouTube videos where they address the issue with animation, and it makes it very difficult for an adult, or a mature adult I should say, to take it seriously when it's done this way. I could not figure out if this whole thing was geared towards adults or kids.
Well, they got
I
30 minutes. Surely they could cover all the bases.
um only very lightly, and they don't talk in there really to any degree worth mentioning about how to spot if a child may be, the victim of abuse of some kind, or something's going on with the child. Most of the video is designed for a CYB approach, cover your butt approach. Make sure there's always another adult with you, which is okay, except that doesn't always happen. And you can't guarantee you're going to have another adult with you.
Right.
In
And
a
here I want to
classroom.
stress this with you, Elsie, because I've been to church. I don't know if it's more recently than you. It was probably about 10 years ago that I stopped attending. But even as of that time, and this is before the membership number started tanking, is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
There still weren't enough people to handle all the callings.
No.
And what generally happens in the LDS church, it isn't always this way. There are exceptions to this rule, and I'm aware of them. But generally, what happens is you have a certain number of callings that have to be filled by active members of the ward. And when you get done with all of those, and there's a lot of them in the LDS church, because we got to keep those members busy, then you get to the people, the adults who are in charge of the 18-month to 3-year-olds in primary.
Mm-hmm.
And usually those are the callings that are left over that get given out in desperation to people to look after them. Now, I know that there's exceptions to that, right? But frequently it's just, okay, well, who doesn't have a calling? Who's not worthy enough to have a real calling?
Yeah, well,
It's kind of how it is. So we'll put the people
Can
who
I
aren't
also-
worthy enough to have a real calling in charge of the little kids.
Can I also point out that oftentimes in primary callings, so
Mm-hmm.
the slightly older children, oftentimes in primary callings, they will link a husband and wife, like a spouse pair,
Yes,
to do that calling together.
Mm-hmm.
And I know people don't want to think about this, but the problem I see with that approach, which is kind of the standard I've seen in every ward I've ever been in, and I've got a few years on URFM because I was attending right up until 2022. Even though people don't want to think about this, oftentimes, like, one spouse can be complicit in another spouse's abuse or know about the other spouse's abuse and not do anything about it. And I'm sorry to, like, confront people with that reality, but it's another thing that I think the church needs to think about. If they really want to send the message that they don't tolerate abuse, that's something that they need to think about. Like, is it really appropriate to have too deep leadership where really we could be in a situation exactly like we'll talk about when we talk about some of these cases where maybe the mother knows about the abuse and hasn't done anything about it.
And when you have an isolation situation, for example, you have two people in a classroom and one person takes the child to the bathroom.
yes.
Why not have the camera outside to ensure that adult is staying outside while the kid is going into the bathroom? They don't do these precautionary safety methods. Now, I haven't been inside of a Mormon ward house in 28 years, a long time ago. But I've asked questions. I talk to people. They don't put cameras in Mormon ward houses. They just don't. They never have. If you think about it, only with COVID did they start doing that and videotaping the meetings. But they don't do it for the rest of it. They don't do the Sunday school classes. I've actually gone online to see if I could catch an LDS Sunday school class online. You can't. Okay. So that tells me they're not doing it. Also, something other churches are doing that I think is a very good thing is, let's say they only have one kid. This was in the video. Sister Umpty Frats goes in and there's only one student in there. What should she do? Well, the correct answer is she's supposed to join with another class. Well, that's good. Take the kid into another class. I got a news flash for them. She may or may not do it. Or he may or may not do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to teach teenagers when I was in the LDS church and this was many, many years ago before this was even brought up as an issue, but I'd be in there alone with a class full of teenagers. And I felt perfectly safe because I could sit on any of them. But the point I'm getting at is that you've got, say, a male teacher in there with a bunch of boys, and one boy has to go out. Who's he going to send him out with? Another man? Is his wife going to be in there? Priesthood meetings, I'm sorry, guys, I know you're males. They're not really set up for the teenage boys to be safe. You take a 13-year-old deacon, and he's going to go to the bathroom by himself, but is he safe? Where's the cameras in the hallway so that you can see that he's safe going out? Where's the camera in the priesthood meeting? Are there going to be 2 men in there? What are their precautions? I'm not seeing anything in any of this letter that tells us any viable precautions whatsoever.
And I
Okay,
will tell
sorry.
you that once, and I was still going to church, but I had gone to another church. It was evangelical Christian church.
Yeah, those darn
And
people.
I was getting the tour with some people who had been former members of the LDS church who were friends of mine. So they invited me. I went over there. We had the service. It was really nice. The main thing I want to focus on is that we left that building, the worship building, to go into the Sunday school building. And I wasn't going to go to Sunday school, but I was just walking around. And I was so surprised at the way it was set up. First off, lots of color. But second off, in every room, there was a huge hole cut out with a big plastic, I think it was concave or convex, clear plastic insert in the door. So the effect is this whole place is wide open.
Right.
You don't have to go walking up and, move something to the side and look around. It's just exposed to you.
Yes.
Everything's exposed. And I just thought, wow, that is such a difference in feeling between that and walking down the halls of the Mormon Church with all the doors closed to the classrooms.
It is, and I don't know why they won't do something like that. They could take that frosted glass, have it cut out, and put in clear glass. It's not a difficult fix.
No, it's not. And certainly they have the money to do it, but they don't have the will. But once again, this is the whole idea here is these are very simple fixes that other churches have already done successfully and are doing. And the LDS Church seems to be digging in its heels and refusing to adopt and implement these obvious and easy measures to help with the safety of the children at church.
Yeah.
All right, let's see what we got here. I had to move to that other slide. So is this something we haven't talked about before? Number 5, does abuse happen? He writes. Austin Fife writes, does abuse happen in the church more often than abuse happens at home, in our schools, or even in other churches? At which point I want to say, objection, Your Honor, relevance.
Yeah.
That was my big takeaway from this question as well, because this is, I think, this is the fallacy that Austin is setting up. He's basically setting up that unless the answer to that question is yes, unless the church demonstrates more cases of abuse than homes, schools, and churches, that's the only way he sees there to have been a problem. And I think, like we've already talked about a number of times, the question isn't like the question he's asking. The question is, how does the church handle these cases when they do happen?
Right. And, he's stacking the deck, and he basically admits he's stacking the deck. I think I've done a lot of research and I've done a lot of reading of what Elsie wrote and other places. But when he says this, we already know, and I'll ask Elsie, the single most common place that sex abuse is going to happen to children is going to be at home, right?
Yes.
Yes. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to compare the LDS church rates of sex abuse with sex abuse of children that happens in the home, which we already know is going to be far and away the most common. That's what I mean by stacking the deck. What he should be doing is looking at churches exclusively in percentages if he wants to pursue what I consider to be an irrelevant line of inquiry.
Well, and Jennifer Roach does that when she points to the Boy Scout data.
And we can come to that. Now, I know that that's true, and I know we have a slide on that, which will help illustrate it. So I didn't want you to talk about it without the slide, because I think that will help. But Jennifer Roach, it's important to say, Jennifer Roach is the expert that the church now has as a member that the church wants to trot out as their expert to say that the church is actually doing better than anybody else at protecting children. Do I have that right, Elsie?
There's a reason why they picked her. Do you mind if I explain that reason? Because there's other therapists that deal with this in the Mormon Church. They picked her because she herself had been a victim. And you can't attack a person who's been a victim. That's the atmosphere of the society we're in right now.
Well, no one would want to attack her, but I think if
Well,
I'm
but
understanding you
see,
right,
any
what you mean is you
criticism
can't
is
even
going to be an
challenge her.
attack.
You can't even question her.
Any criticism is going to be an attack. Any criticism of her data is going to be viewed as an attack because, she can always back up, punt, and said, yeah, but I was a victim of an evangelical pastor. And see, that means they're not any better than we are. And besides, why are you attacking me? I was a victim too.
Mm-hmm.
And
Have you ever seen her do that?
I've not seen her do that, but I have seen her bring up continuously that it was an evangelical pastor that did it.
Well, that's helpful because the church is never going to have their expert be somebody who was actually molested at the Mormon Church.
Right.
She also recurrently works with Jacob Hess, that Jacob Z. Hess, RFM that we talked about that lied explicitly about the Arizona Bisby case. So they've done a lot of work on this issue together because his background is in mental health, like community mental health counseling or something like that. He has a PhD, but yeah, I agree with what Elsie has said. The way that Roach has kind of become the church's, they get these like standard apologists that they trot out anytime there's like a particular issue. Like they'll always go to Guy and Muhlstein on Book of Abraham issues, for example.
Right.
She's now apparently become the apologist for this stuff. And to Elsie's point, I'm confused on why she would offer some of the arguments that she does. And I know that's our next slide, so maybe we move into that.
Yes, Ms. Roach is the cause celeb for Mormon child abuse defense. Yeah. All right, it is here. So this is what he writes about Jennifer Roach. Jennifer Roach, a mental health therapist and a convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, addresses these questions in a fair conference speech titled Shedding Light on the Complexities, Understanding Abuse Within the LDS Church. So this is where Austin Fife now introduces Jennifer Roach, this cause celeb, right, as we talked about, to quote from her and from her presentation at FAIR. Once again, FAIR is one of the biggest apologetic institutions for and in behalf of the LDS Church.
I also just have to point out, since FAIR, people who have done some level of deconstruction are usually familiar with this, but FAIR offers some of the worst apologetics out there. They were kind of my last stop on my way out of the church, reading their apologetics and how they'll excuse literally anything. So I just have to highlight that, remember the entire premise of Austin's book. I try not to get too meta with this stuff, but the entire point of Austin's book is I left the church, even though we know from his interviews that he never stopped going to the church, but we'll set that aside for a second. I left the church, and through investigation, I resolved my concerns. All he does is recycle apologetics from other people, including from some of the most strident defenders of the church that will defend anything the church has done, no matter how ridiculous. And to that point, FAIR is the group that wrote the apologetics on the White Salamander letter that Dallin Oaks was echoing as being adopted into the faithful narrative before they discovered it was a forgery by Mark Hoffman. So I'm just trying to highlight the whole premise of this letter is I investigated my concerns I had over leaving the church, and then I came to good answers, but look at what he's actually going to as far as sources. He has basically a propagandist arm of the church validating what he wants to be true of the church. So for people who come to the Light and Truth letter thinking that it's like an honest or unbiased evaluation of these issues, I'm just highlighting the source that he's parroting here.
It doesn't touch your argument, which I think is excellent. But in 1985, when this happened, I believe it was Farms. I don't even think
you're right. I'm sorry. It was
well,
Farms.
And they're also the same group that at one point, this goes way back, was kind of touting the idea that Quetzalcoatl might have been Jesus in the Americas.
He totally was Jesus. Quetzalcoatl.
Okay.
It's an anagram for Jesus. Just mix those letters around.
Okay.
And
you think that's funny or something, Elsie?
Pardon me?
Do you think that's funny?
I do.
Why?
I don't know. Maybe it has something to do with knowing what Quetzalcoatl really was about.
Yeah, you only want to hear what the Mormon missionaries tell you about Quetzalcoatl. He's the great white god of the Mayans who promised that one day he healed people, and he wore fancy outfits. They'll probably tell you it was
Was
all
that
white.
before or after he threw virgins off?
We don't talk about the virgins, okay? Except that was
Virgin sacrifice
we
doesn't
don't talk
count.
about that about Quetzalcoatl. We don't talk about all that stuff. It's not like Jesus, okay? We just focus on those little bits, say that's all there is, and he left and he's coming back again someday. So that really clinches the Jesus vibe. So I think that on Jennifer Roach,
Yeah.
there's a picture of her.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something now that Austin Fife is quoting from her. He introduces these 7 points or 7 unique practices that she's come up with that she presents in this fair conference to show how great the LDS Church is at protecting their nestlings. Here's the quote from Austin Fife. Additionally, Jennifer Roach suggests 7 unique practices in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that further protect our children and youth. So we're going to go through each of these with a separate slide, 1 through 7. But in general, do either of you have anything you want to say about these 7 things that Jennifer Roach has come up with?
Well, I want to know if they came out of her mind or if there was something given to her. Nobody ever says what the source of these 7 is, and I'd be interested in knowing.
Well, somebody came up with them.
Well, I know that, but we don't know who.
And the basic idea is that we've got to look at the LDS Church as it is, because we're really not interested in changing. But we've got to look at it as it is and then use it as it is in order to formulate things out of it that we are going to say help protect the children. And some of these may a little bit. Some of these seem to be kind of irrelevant. But we'll go through each and every one of them. But there she is, in case you want to give Jennifer Roach, Lee, you said, a call for some therapy.
My overall thought is much like we talked about with Austin, the fact that, like you just said, Arfem, some of these 7 may help prevent abuse doesn't mean that there isn't more that can be done. That's the question that we're talking about.
Because none of these are having cameras in every room or cameras in the hallway and including outside the bathrooms and windows in the classrooms. They're not here. They didn't make the top 7. Why? Because the LDS Church doesn't do them. This is an apologetic piece to defend the status quo, and that's all it is. So here's number 1. Oh, excuse me. This is the slide where I had grabbed the it's from the FAIR website, and if you want to go there and watch her presentation, it's available there. Sexual abuse in the LDS Church, frequently asked questions. This caused a bit of buzz when it happened a few years ago. So here's 7.1. So this is number 7, sub 1. All right, and we'll go down through sub 7, all 7 of these things. I had the devil's own time figuring out how I was going to label these, but that's what I came up with eventually. 7-1, the calling system. So the calling system over there on the right, the church calls people to serve in various assignments. They do not volunteer. What do you think about that, Elsie, as a way to protect children?
You know, they called my husband shortly after he became a member and became an elder. They called him to the bishopric, the 4th member of the bishopric, I would say, the ward clerk, which is a job where you are privy to all kinds of personal information. And they called him to do it because of what he did in the Navy, able to keep a secret, cryptologic technician, technical chief. Okay. And the bishop even told him that was why.
Yes.
So there's no guessing there. But, it's kind of interesting because being called is a matter of people trying to decide who would be best for the job and who might want to do it and then approaching them. I don't know. Does that make any difference from volunteering, especially when their own LDS newsletter refers to these folks as volunteers? I mean, if you're not being paid to do something, what does that make you?
Yes.
Okay.
I think what Austin's or what Jennifer Roach is trying to say is that the predators, the child predators in the ward, don't get to volunteer for the primary teachers,
Yeah.
okay? They are
But
called, so it's more random than that.
It's worse
well,
than that,
okay,
though,
but
because
it's worse than that because they don't know who they're calling because they don't do any of the backgrounds. They don't know who they're dealing with, and they're going by their feelings. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump on in your way,
no,
Kirby.
you made my point better than I could. I just wanted to add that if we flip this around, and we're not necessarily thinking about protection, but we're thinking about the message that this sends, right?
Mhm.
When you are a child that's received abuse inside of the church or from a church member, and then you know that that individual has been called and supposedly called of God to do something, it can lead again to that secondary trauma I talked about on the front end during our introductory comments of, like, I literally have letters from the victims in our local case where they write in their victim impact statements asking that exact question, like basically saying that I gaslighted myself thinking that what happened to me wasn't that bad because after it happened, this person was called as a bishop and therefore God must have seen something good or redeemable in this person. And I just want to highlight for people who will say that that isn't the church's doctrine, that's where I would point to. There's a talk in October 2017's conference by Henry Eyring, who's in the first presidency,
Oh,
called
I
The
know.
Lord, that says the Lord, it's called The Lord Leads His Church. And he says in that talk, it takes faith to believe that he, God, it's capitalized, God knows the people he calls perfectly, both their capacities and their potential, so he makes no mistakes in his calls. Then it continues and he says, it takes even greater faith to believe that the Lord has called imperfect human certain servants to lead you. And he's specifically talking about human weaknesses and stuff. And this is just where, Jennifer's excuses may work on the one
Mhm.
end, but she has to pick up both ends of the stick and think about the message that the calling system sends to children who are abused, to her credit, oftentimes at home, not in the church setting, but that calling system has two parts of it that you have to pick up and consider. How does the
Well,
calling system affect children who are
and in the
survivors of abuse?
home and in the church can merge. My father, who was my abuser, worthy elder, was also was also a leader in the Boy Scouts.
Right.
So I mean, really, and it
Wait a
was
second,
the troop
Elsie.
affiliated with the Word, huh?
Elsie, your father
Yes.
who was sexually abusing you was called as a
And my
member of the
sister,
church to be the leader of the Boy Scouts?
not the leader. He was the assistant scoutmaster.
Still,
Still,
he's put in a
still.
position of authority within the Boy Scout system at
He had
church.
several. He had several different callings throughout his lifetime in the Mormon
Yes.
Church. Yes.
And can I just say that as a person who was molested when I was a kid, not in the
Mhm.
home, but by some stranger guy, fate brought us together. And I've talked about it in a different podcast. I was 10 years old. I won't talk about it here. But I was one of the many, many kids who get molested that it's just a crime of opportunity.
Mhm.
And so this calling system doesn't do anything about
Doesn't.
crimes of opportunity. In fact, in some ways, it's the definition of a
Well,
crime of
there's
opportunity.
a deception involved when you think that. I say this all the time in churches and everything too. Every brain fart you have is not a message from God. It's a brain fart. It doesn't mean God's telling you something. If God is God and you believe God is not prone to mistakes, then why would God tell you to put a child molester in charge of something? He
Hmm.
wouldn't, would he? I don't think so.
Well, that's just because you don't have enough faith, Elsie. Did you not
I'm
hear
so
the quote that
sorry.
Colby read from President Eyring? It takes faith to believe that God would put a child molester in charge of children.
Takes more faith than I've got.
It's terrible because you can actually just paraphrase his talk and say that,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
It takes faith to believe that God would put a child molester in a place where he could molest children. And yet it happens over and over and over and over again in the church.
Well, and many of these non-volunteers who are called have been responsible for molesting children. So they're still culpable. The church is still culpable in answering how did that happen and what are we going to do about it?
Okay, so number one is the calling system. Number two on Jennifer Roach's list of 7 things the church does that protects the children is being sustained. Here's what she has to say, as quoted by Austin Fife. When someone is called to a new assignment, their name is presented to the congregation for a sustaining vote. If someone has concerns about a newly called leader over children and youth, they have an opportunity to raise those concerns. Elsie.
Well, either Mr. Fife and Miss Roach are sleeping during fast and testimony services, or they're intentionally trying to gaslight the reader, because nobody is ever told outside the family and the people involved who is going to be called to what position until they're presented until fast and testimony meeting. And so how are you supposed to be able to approach them before the meeting and say, I'm sorry, we got a problem with so-and-so here? Or how do you stop the meeting? What do you, everybody else is putting their arm to their square and sustaining the person, and you're going to jump up and go, no, I don't think so. No, it doesn't work that way. And in the let's see, in the 34 years that I was living an LDS life and going to church, I never once saw anybody object during one of the services.
I didn't
a person
either,
being
unless it was
called.
myself, and that was in a general kind of way at state conference for the general authorities. But you're right. I've never ever seen that happen. And actually, the church structures the sustainings in such a way as to minimize the ability of people to be able to intelligently raise their hand to sustain a person, any person in a calling, because they spring it on them right before they ask them to raise their hand to sustain. And now you're in this whole ward with all the other members there. And are you going to be the person to raise your hand? So this being sustained stuff is really not all it's cracked up to be in the LDS church. For individual local members in their callings, as well as the apostles in their callings, it's something that you do by rote. You're expected to do it. And because they keep the identity of the person who's going to be called a secret until right at the moment that they're told, by the way, just so everybody knows, this person is told when they're interviewed about the job and they accept the job or whatever the calling is, right? Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. This is a secret. So it is designed that nobody know until hand raising time and sustaining time. So because of that, I don't think that being sustained is that big a help in protecting children. But what do you think, Colby?
Well, I also have to highlight that, like, literally on the agenda or like on the ward bulletin or whatever, that is being called and sustained. Like, that's what they call it. We're going to go through the following callings and sustainings. So I just have to point out that Jennifer is already right on item number 2. She's padding the numbers to try and make it look this list look bigger and more impressive. This is part of being called.
Number 1 and number 2 are really,
they're the same thing.
They're kind of, she's got to get the 7. 7's an important number. She's padding the numbers to get the 7. Good point, but being sustained, right? So what do you think about that, Elsie? Any other comments from you?
Well, I just want to say that it's like so many things in the LDS church that you vote on, but you don't know what the heck you're voting for. Right. You don't know who you may or may not. It might be you're in a small ward or a branch, and that might be one thing, but 9 times out of 10, you don't know that person as well as you'd like to think you do, unless you've gone to the same ward for a long time.
Elsie, I can tell you. I'm sorry, Colby, go ahead.
I was going to say, to that point, Elsie, I have talked about this in a few different areas. I've never really talked about the specific identity, like using the name of the abusing bishop that was in our ward. But I had known this person since I was like 7 or 8 years old. I had known this person for decades. We had grown up together. We had been in the same ward growing up together. And I had no idea that this person had those proclivities and was doing that activity dating back over 10 years. And after it all came out, of course, I got a bunch of calls from people who were like, hey, because this person, before they were a bishop, was in a stake youth calling for, over 5 years. And I got a bunch of calls from people saying like, yeah, we thought it was kind of weird when we were at girls camp and he was the only male leader in with the teenage girls swimming around in the pool, but nobody said anything. And I think what I'm highlighting with that story is people don't know, to your point. And second is Mormonism is also a culture of compliance and nicety where people are so afraid to raise any concern, especially about a leader. I mean, look at Number 2 in the church, Dallin Oaks. It is wrong to criticize the leaders of the church, even if the criticism is true. The culture is rotten to the core on having a healthy attitude towards having conversations about this issue and about, any weakness in leaders. I mean, again, back to Eyring. Eyring said that if you even think of human weaknesses in your leaders, that's something that you should repent of. I mean, I don't understand how people can't see the systemic issue here when you have such a toxic culture of affirming whatever the leaders say.
For those who have never been to a Mormon church meeting or LDS church meeting, let me help you understand that because there are so many callings in every ward, and every ward should have around 200 active members. So I understand that they have dropped those requirements due to people bailing out of the church at such an alarming rate. But it used to be you have to have around 200 active people in a ward for it to be fully functioning with all the different callings that they have. So because of that, because people are going in and out of callings all the time, when you are in sacrament meeting, which is a basic worship service at the beginning, there are announcements and there are releasings, people being released from callings or people being called to replace them in those callings. And it happens with a great deal of frequency. So people pay no attention. People pay no attention to this. That's the other thing. People are trained to not pay attention to callings because back when I joined the church back in 78 or 79, I can't remember, but there was this story that went around. I can't remember if I was actually present when it happened. Maybe I was. But that the bishop went up there and he's making his announcements and the callings and sustainings. And what he said was, as a test, right, to see if anybody was paying attention, okay, I'm now going to propose for a sustaining vote that we move Mount Rainier 1 mile to the south. And everybody, all in favor, every hand went up.
All the hands go up. Yeah.
Absolutely. Nobody was opposed. Maybe a couple people, caught it. But yeah, it's basically lemming country out there when it comes to raising your hand. You will sustain anything that your priesthood leader tells you to sustain. And you're not even paying attention. So once again, this eats away at this supposed protection, number 2, of being sustained.
Well, and exactly when are you supposed to discuss your objection? You can't discuss it beforehand.
You can't do it before because you don't know about it.
You can't do it during the service.
And then they've already been sustained. Unless you're going to raise your hand, and actually, because they're going to keep going unless you stand up and start shouting. To come to
and then you're going to be asked to sit down or leave.
Right. So, we'll talk to you afterward or whatever, but it just it is so slanted in favor of sustaining that it's very rare to have anybody oppose on these things. And I think that's the point we're all trying to make there. All right, so that's being sustained. The next thing is existing association 7-3, which goes as follows. Wards and stakes are organized by geographic boundaries. We all know that. And we also know the fact that under Mormonism, you are not supposed to go to the church you like. You're supposed to go to the church where you live. It is very strict on that geographic stuff. A predator cannot go from church to church to find new victims. Now, that struck me as a bit of a non sequitur. Can I ask you, Colby, what did you think about that? Was that a non sequitur?
Yeah, I don't see how this is preventing anything at all because, one, people can go from church to church. One is just like a visitor, or they can move. I think the other issue with this is it's, I don't know, this list is really hard for me to follow because, like you said, RFM, I do just think it's a non sequitur. It just doesn't follow that it leads to any protection.
Right. In other words, even if this is true and taken on its face, we'll get right back to Elsie. What you're saying is that the predators in one ward can only predate upon the children in that ward. Right. And they can't go find new victims in other wards. So that's a protection. Well, because the victims in the other wards are going to be predated on by the predators in their ward, right?
They go by availability most of the time. So limiting boundaries means very little. They'll just find another kid in the ward.
Right. And if this is your goal, if this is the reason that you are a member or a primary motivating factor for why it is that you are a member of the church, you've got no problem going to another church because it's not like they're going to be investigating you when you go to another church, as long as you don't want to have a calling, right? You can go
Well,
to another church, and you could also lie about where you live. That's easy. Believe me, they're
and
dying to
also,
have
as long
members.
as there's no mandatory reporting, how are the people from one ward to the other going to know?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Unless they pass it along in a record. But I think if you've been to Floodlit, you've read probably at least 2 or 3 incidences where the record was passed along, but the new bishop paid no attention.
Right.
And bishops are so swamped, and they're so
I
ill
know.
prepared, and all they've watched is a 30-minute cartoon.
Yeah,
If
that's
that,
all they
and
get.
that's if we're lucky.
However,
if
they
they've
do
watched it.
get the helpline. They get the helpline to nowhere.
And I just want to tell you, on behalf of the bishops, which I've never been one, but I've seen a lot in action and known some,
Yeah.
they are not the bishop of child abuse, right? This is
Right.
this is one issue among 100 that they are tasked with doing.
Yep.
And I don't mean that to say this isn't important, but I mean it sure gets diluted because a bishop has to do they have to watch all these other videos, they have to go to all this other training about a host of different subjects. And this just gets pushed to the side. It's one of a million other things they have to do. So the best that can happen is if they actually watch the 30-minute video. But even then, they're woefully unprepared.
Yeah.
Maybe part of the problem is that they're told by the church that by watching this 30-minute cartoon, they are prepared. So that's the part with the existing associations, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that there is a great problem that the church has, not only understanding the motivations of a child, of a pedophile, okay, which are things that are not really subject to repentance in the traditional Mormon way of viewing it. That you do something wrong, you feel bad about it, and you repent of it, and you don't do it anymore. And it's as simple as that. This is not as simple as that. But it gets treated as if it's just one among many sins, when actually it is very, very different in that.
Well,
So
and I want to throw out too that when it comes to helping victims, the church is pretty bad on that list. If you go to their own website, however, they do ask bishops who Fife himself and others mentioned that bishops aren't equipped for this. They're not equipped enough to handle victims and counsel with victims, but suddenly they're equipped enough to deal with perpetrators. I myself have talked with more than one, I'll just say more than one pedophile or person who assaulted children. First of all, let me tell you, that was probably some of the hardest conversations I've had in my life.
I'll
And
bet.
number two, oh, yeah.
And
And
Elsie,
number
just as a
two,
chilling side thought, we've all talked to pedophiles, whether we know it or not.
well, I mean, actual
Yes, but
prosecuted. Yeah,
you know
okay.
this person's a
You
pedophile
know
you're
they are.
talking to. Yeah.
And it's an endless stream of BS, to be honest with you.
It's all
Very
excuses and
few. It's all
justifications and
excuses,
distractions.
justifications, denials is a big one. But it's chilling to go through that with them. I think throughout, I think I've had like 12 interviews over the years, and only in 2 of those did the person actually admit, yes, I did it. And I'm not exactly sure why, but I was wrong to do it.
Mm.
Those were a totally different type of scenario. And one of them had to do with my own father, by the way.
Mm.
So I will say that if a bishop is not equipped and trained to deal with a victim, he sure is shooting not equipped and trained to deal with the perpetrators. And I agree with you. Too much is expected of these untrained men. Just way
Who
too much.
have full-time, at least, jobs that
Mm-hmm.
they're
And
doing on the
families of their
side
own.
of being a bishop and taking care of a family with
Mm-hmm.
kids, usually young
Yeah.
kids as a bishop, and
Mm-hmm.
they're supposed to do all this. This is a full-time job.
It
This is
is.
why in other churches, it's a full-time job.
You have a thing called a pastor who gets
Yes,
paid
yes.
to do just all of that. Yeah.
Elsie, was I understanding from what you said that before he passed, your dad admitted to you that what
Mm-hmm.
he had done?
Yes. That's a whole other story.
Okay. Well, that's
That would make
significant.
this go into a 3-hour.
Because the thing is, once again, criminal defense attorney, you learn about a lot of stuff that you wouldn't
Mhm.
otherwise. But my understanding is that in society, because of society's attitudes, which I think are justified about people who commit child sexual abuse, the flip side of that is that if a person does commit child sex abuse, that becomes, I think, the single most difficult thing to disclose for them or to admit to.
Yeah.
Murder is easier to admit to than child abuse.
Well, in my
Virtually
father's
anything.
case, he had come very close to dying. He had a quadruple bypass, heart bypass, and had just been diagnosed. Well, they were looking at him, hadn't diagnosed it yet, pancreatic cancer. And I think he was at a point in his life where he realized he had hurt his daughters, because it was my sister and I. And he did tell me that he went and got help through psychiatric counseling at American University. So, he went and sought help because he was, I guess, the way he worded it made me think that he was afraid he'd kind of go outside the house boundaries and molest other people's children. And he didn't, he had his demon. He had his demon. There's no doubt about it. He did not molest my brothers. I talked with my brothers and nothing to them. So, and one of my brothers won't admit that anything ever happened in our family. So, but it was a rarity. And then the other gentleman I spoke with who admitted to it, he was up in years. So the younger molesters, for the most part, will not admit to it because they know what would happen to them, especially if they're in prison.
And they're quite earnest and quite, sometimes quite credible in their denials.
Yeah.
And these are the people who are the adults who are talking to the bishops and denying that anything like this ever happened.
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, bishops unprepared are going to believe them
Yes.
and think the kid's making it up or misunderstanding something innocent that happened.
There was a point like that exactly in our local story, where when I was having follow-up conversations with the stake president and the area president, part of my problem with the way they handled this particular case was they didn't give the members of the ward any notice. So this person had been the bishop. He had been a stake youth leader. So he was intimately involved with people that were in the age range that he had this attraction to, that were the same age as his victims. And this was the exact point I was making with the stake president at one point when he said, like, well, we didn't feel like we had to do that because he told us that the abuse never went outside of the home. And I was like, well, hang on a second. Why would you be believing the words of the man that you know for a fact lied to you about his worthiness and his qualifications to be a bishop? Like, you're taking the person who caused the problem's word on the scope of the problem. Like, how in the world do you get to make that decision? And the parents of the children who are interviewed by this person, they don't even get access to that information to make that determination for themselves, whether they need to have a follow-up conversation with their own children.
Colby, are you saying that the people who called the bishop should be the stake president and others above him, right?
Right.
Because it's a bishop, it's a big deal. That they knew about this when he was called as a bishop?
No, they didn't know about it. I'm saying that though they're taking his word for the scope of the problem, like, I only abuse these people in my home, this is after they know that while they're talking to him in his worthiness interviews to be a bishop, they now know they know that he lied, and they know that he's been engaged in this deception for over a decade. Why in the world are they taking his word on the scope of the problem? To both of your point, this is something that abusers never freely and fairly admit to. Well, very rarely.
Very rare.
Oftentimes when they try
there's pressure put on them.
And usually only when they're really caught red-handed will they admit. But most of the time, even if they're caught red-handed, they won't admit.
But even then, even when they'll admit, right, they'll do the classic thing. What I've seen in these cases is they'll admit to some lesser included something and try and pass it off as some misunderstanding. Like, this individual's excuse was, like, I heard this so many times from members of our ward, that he was just wrestling around with the girls and it got out of hand and he accidentally grabbed one of their breasts. Like, and that's where my knowledge of the legal system just wouldn't let me leave this alone, because I looked at the charges and he was arrested on a warrant, which means that a judge sat there, heard the evidence, and the evidence, the charge that he was charged with involved, I'm not trying to be graphic, but involved penetration to some extent. And so I knew that, I'm not saying that made him guilty, but as RFM knows, if he's arrested on a warrant, that means that at the very least, a judge who's supposed to be neutral and detached from it heard the evidence and decided that it was more probable than not that he had engaged in that behavior that involved penetration. So I knew that that story can't have been at least the full extent of the story.
Yeah.
Okay, so trying to synopsize is, I think I'm understanding you, which is that because of your knowledge of the law and the statutes in Idaho, there are different offenses, right?
Correct.
If there's penetration involved, it's child rape. It's rape of a child.
It's
okay?
in Idaho, it's known as lewd and lascivious conduct.
Lewd and lascivious. Everybody has their different names for it, okay? But lewd and lascivious. And just, sorry for saying just, but if you don't penetrate a child, but simply have sexual contact, such as grabbing the breast that you talked about,
Right.
that's a different crime and a lesser crime, though still serious.
Right.
And what's
It
that
would be
called
like-
in Idaho?
It would be like sexual exploitation of a child.
Okay. So I think what Colby's saying is this, is that he knows the law. He
Yeah.
knows that the bishop was charged with the lewd and lascivious, which means penetration. All right.
It means there's at least something in the file that was presented to a judge
Yes.
that a judge said, yes, it's more likely than not that this specific offense versus a lesser included offense occurred. Yes.
Right. So what I'm trying to say is that you know that the law that he's charged with violating includes penetration of the minor. But you also know that all he's admitting to is something that would have never amounted to a justification for that charge. It would have been the lesser charge of the child molestation.
Exactly. And the bishop and the subsequent bishop and the stake president, to bring this back around, both on the scope of the problem and then the extent of the problem, like what he had actually done, they're taking his word after they knew that he had lied, that he had lied about his qualifications to be a bishop in the first place.
Yeah, this is the bank robber swearing, I only robbed this bank.
Exactly.
I would never rob any other banks. What? Are you kidding? What kind of person do you think I am? I only robbed this bank. All right, let's go to the next one. That was 7.3, existing associations. 7.4, the member number system. The church has a membership record and ID number for every member. True. Some of us have SCMC files too. This number follows every member, even in different countries. So a lot of weight being hung on the slender thread of this member number system. What do you think, Elsie? Is that going to protect kids?
The existence of a record system like that doesn't guarantee that it's going to be useful in keeping track of predators. First of all, you have to know that they're predators to begin with to make the tracking record even useful at all. We have databases that track molesters and rapists, and the LDS Church isn't obligated to do that. They're not obligated to have a database that includes the member number so that it can be passed along or be accessed. They don't cooperate with the police departments in disclosing any kind of database. If they had one, they probably wouldn't under the, papacy, privacy, or whatever it's called, privilege thing. And there's also the issue of if a person doesn't make their new addresses, say they move and they don't make their new address available to the old ward, from the old ward to the new ward,
right?
Nobody would necessarily be able to find them.
Right. Those are the stacks of papers that the membership records that pile up in the old ward. Because every ward has a stack of them, of people who have left, and they know they've left because they've gone to their old address and they're not there anymore. And that's all they know.
Yeah. And
because
it doesn't
they left without
prevent
giving any word.
Having an ID number assigned to a person, while it's great for controlling individuals and what they may or may not be able to access online, doesn't do anything to prevent abuse in the ward that person's in or the ward that person moves to if they're not caught.
Well, let me turn it over to Colby and say, okay, so best case scenario on this, there is a person who is a pedophile who has some kind of, I don't know, pedophile marking on their membership record that follows them to the next ward where they move to predate some more. Does that provide any kind? It must provide some kind of protection. Do you think, Colby, any at all?
Well, the way it's written, I don't think just having a record system does actually prevent. Now, if the church did do those annotations, that's what they call it on a record, and they kept track of it and they very carefully watch these individuals, it may. But I know of multiple cases where people have had those annotations on their record and that's been completely disregarded by their new bishop. There was that case that came out in 2022, I think, the individual in Minnesota who had been charged with child sex abuse in Utah and then moves to Minnesota and was called into an elders quorum presidency. I know that someone in that ward, Michael Benjamin, spoke out on Mormon Stories about being involved in that. I think it was Adam. What was his name?
It's okay if you don't remember it, but so were the facts sufficiently developed in that case, Colby? I know you're doing something, but were they developed enough in that case to know whether the bishop had actually looked and not seen it, or whether he just didn't even bother looking?
I don't remember off of the top of my head the individual's name, the sex offender, and he was a registered sex offender that was then called as an elders quorum, either an elders quorum president or in the elders quorum presidency. But he had contact with another young man that he abused after this was already known and disclosed to the church. His name was Michael Adam Davis, and the Mormon Stories episode was 1595 for people who want to see how the church handled that in that situation. Now, mistakes in record keeping happen, but we would really hope that the church did a better job of keeping these particular records, especially when Jennifer Roach is offering this as a protection to this problem, when we know of a case that's been reported nationwide in the last couple of years where that didn't happen. It's a little hard to take her defense of this program being a protection seriously.
Let me add here, because it is helpful for contrast, that while she has member number system, okay, what is not on this list of 7 is doing background checks.
Yeah.
This is supposed to fill the gap for not doing background checks on all members of the church who get callings that deal with kids or supervisory over kids, whatever. There is no requirement for that. And when you realize that that is not on this list, you see what a weak kind of substitute the member number system is for that. All right.
Like I said, we have national databases of sex offenders and state databases. And the Mormon Church needs its own little database.
Right. They have to have their own little database, right? Because this is God's database. Why not just hook in to the mainframe guys and do a search for every single person and make that a requirement?
I don't know.
Make it a requirement. A box that has to be checked before any calling is issued.
First, you got to get a leadership under the age of 199 who are willing to use the technology.
We're just grateful to have leaders who have so much experience, Elsie. And they got a lot of experience. Imagine if you lined them all up end to end, they might go back to Jesus. So here's 7.5. The 5th thing in the LDS Church that helps protect children from child sexual abuse. Gender-specific leaders for young women, which is a way of saying women are called to be over the young women. There's a young women's presidency in the ward as well as in the stake, as well as a general. And I think that's what they're getting at here. So let me read this. Number 5, men are more likely to abuse. I think that's true. Men are more likely to abuse, and teenage girls are more likely to be victims of abuse than teenage boys. Okay, I think that's true. There's a sizable boy victim population, and I'm one of them. But so it's not completely true, but I think it's true that there's probably more girls than men as victims, or girls and boys. Direct adult leaders, it goes on. Direct adult leaders for girls are women. So this is better than if they had men being in the young women's presidency at the ward. Would you agree, Elsie?
But who's over those women?
Men. But what's your point?
Oh, my point is that actually does give them some access. Plus, the women do what the men tell them to do, for the most part. I was just reading on Floodlit about a primary girl who was told by one of the primary teachers, the bishop wants to see you, and she goes to the bishop's office where he, proceeds to molest her. So if you've got men in charge of, why not just let the women be in charge of the women's stuff and the girls' stuff? If this is the point she's making, why does the church even have the men involved?
I think this one's a lie, if you can hear me out on this. So she's right that we do have women leaders, and I agree with everything you said, Elsie. She's right that we do have direct women leaders in the young women's program, but the way this is worded, it's like she's acting that Sunday school doesn't exist, where you can have a male Sunday school teacher or you can have a male primary teacher. She's completely ignoring, in other words, a non-Mormon may see that term young women and think it's talking about the women in the ward who are young. She's actually talking about the young women's program specifically, not how young women are treated throughout the church as a whole. And then, as Elsie highlighted, it's really not even true, because direct adult leaders for girls are women. That's not true. The bishop is the leader of the ward. He's literally called the father of the ward. And there are tons of male leaders who are over those young women and girls. So
and every single one of those young women and girls gets a worthiness interview, and it's not with her female Sunday school teacher.
Exactly.
That's right. It's with the bishop. Good point. I want to elaborate on what Colby just said. I think it's an excellent point, because there is a Young Women's Association in the Mormon Church, and they will have their own meetings. But that's not Sunday school. It's a separate program.
Totally
in the
different.
Sunday school, there are classes from 18 months all the way up to 18 years, I believe, is what it is. And so you got boys and girls in Sunday school classes going all the way up. And they are, I would say, just as likely to have a female teacher over that class behind the closed door as they are to have a male teacher teaching that class behind a closed door. So is that what you're talking about, Colby, that this is in some way a lie? Or in a way, it's a misdirection. It's stating only a part of the truth while ignoring the other part of the truth, the Sunday school part of the truth, and the fact that there are leaders, male leaders, over these young women's leaders. They're omitting that as well in order to give a false impression of safety.
Exactly. That was my point. Yes.
Okay. Elsie, anything you wanted to say else about this?
Nope.
Then we'll go on to 7.6, which is withdrawal of membership or excommunication. Number 6, if a member is caught abusing kids, that's the if.
If.
Stanislavskian if. If a member is caught abusing kids, they will be kicked out of the church. And First Presidency approval is required for them to come back. This is not the case in other churches and organizations. Why
that's
that part in there? Why that?
Can I just say that's a lie?
What is that about? Is that true, Elsie? This is not true. No other church, when there is a pedophile who's caught abusing kids in that church, none of them are ever going to be kicked out of that church.
She's talking about her background, from her background experience, where she didn't come forward as a 15-year-old until, after things started evolving, and she finally came out and said, this is happening. The guy got caught. He was passed along, but it shouldn't have been done. Okay. And he was passed along, but she's confusing what happened in a non-denominational, I will say, where there's no oversight with non-denominational evangelical churches. They have no oversight. They don't have a commission, a committee, or any of that stuff.
Every ward is independently run, or every congregation.
Well, in when you have non-denominational, it's independent of everything. Okay.
Right.
So if you have like a Southern Baptist church, which is the one I'm most familiar with, each congregation is, autonomous in terms of voting who they want for the pastor, that kind of thing, what color carpet they want, that kind of thing. But in a case like this, where somebody is found to be molesting children, they are not allowed to go anywhere near that church.
Of course.
Period. And once they are arrested, hopefully they're arrested before this even happens. And most of the time they would be, if the, I would say if the, mandatory people are reporting as they should. I know in our particular church, which is an SBC church, when I talked with the pastor, I said, suppose there was a known child molester in here who was known to have molested a child, what would we do? And he said, before or after I kill them? I went, whoa. He said, no, immediate phone call to the authorities and they investigate, they take it over. In the meantime, he's not even allowed in the building. Okay.
Not for a second. So where does
No,
Austin, or if he's correctly quoting Jennifer Roach, where does she come up with this? I think this was an Austin Fife edition, that this
well,
is not the case in other churches.
yeah, I think that he put that in there maybe, or he's going by what she related in her story. But there's two key words in this whole thing that make all the difference. If, like you mentioned, and caught.
Yeah. And by the
Because that
way,
has happened. They've been caught
yes,
and nothing happened.
yes, because that's a lie too.
That's actually left up to the bishop or stake president, as per their general handbook, to determine whether or not their membership is withdrawn. And may I also state here that if a person's going to molest children, do you really think they care if they get kicked out of the club?
No, because they'll just go down the street to another one.
Uh-huh.
By the way, what I wanted to say about this, that this is not the case in other churches and organizations.
It's not.
He
I
also
don't
says
know.
if a member is caught abusing kids, yes, this was my point. They will be kicked out of the church. Now, here's the thing. What what Austin, what Austin Fife is talking about here, all he's talking about is theory. The theory of the church is very good. The reality of the church is not so good as its theory. What we are dealing with is the reality. What Austin is dealing with is the theory. And in this perspective, and on this subject, as well as a lot of other subjects, but especially this subject, I think the reality is the most important thing. And we have incident after incident after incident, and Colby's going to go into detail in one of those here toward the end of the show, of leadership in the church catching somebody abusing kids and not kicking him out of the church. In fact, calling the hotline and being told not to report it to police. See, this is the problem, is the reality of the situation. If that were true, that would be something that would be good, I suppose. The problem is it's not even true. That a person who is caught molesting kids is not automatically kicked out of the church. In fact, frequently they are protected by the church because the church doesn't want it to reflect on their bad name and they don't want to be civilly liable in a lawsuit. Colby?
I don't think there's anything more powerful that I can say than what you just said. I'll just say, as we walk through those specific examples, I want people to keep in mind, like you just said, how the theory or maybe the aspirations in the handbook actually line up with the lived experience of these cases, and how the church defends itself in court and celebrates some of those results where the reality of these cases are so egregious and so abhorrent. And yet, like I said, the church could change all of this tomorrow with literally several sentence changes in their handbook and do away with at least some of these problems forever. And the fact that they don't want to do it for whatever reason boggles my mind and is a reason I could no longer be a member. See, this is the funny thing about the Light and Truth letter, is Austin seems to think that people can only come to the place that you or I or Elsie are at because we have some animus or some bias against the church. But I actually had every bias in favor of the church when it was this issue in particular that drove me out. It was my integrity on this issue and the reality of this issue that drove me out of the church. And so I don't need anything other than this issue to legitimize my leaving of the church, in my view.
Thank you. Are you scribbling down some notes, Elsie?
No, I'm texting my husband and son and 2 dogs to let them know we're running long.
Oh, okay. Well, say hi for me. Blame it on me, okay? It's my fault. I'll take
I also
responsibility
sent
for this.
a quote from the FAIR website. Bishops operate under the clergy confessional privilege, which helps people who have sinned have confidence that disclosing sins to the bishop will not automatically result in legal action.
That is so disgusting to me.
Would you say
Even
this
the way they
again? Because it's not up
characterize
there on the screen, is it? You're reading from the FAIR website, Elsie?
Well, I'm reading a quote from it,
Would
yes.
you read it again so we can get the full impact, please?
Bishops operate under the clergy confessional privilege, which helps people who have sinned have confidence that disclosing sins to the bishop will not automatically result in legal action.
Can I flip a table for a second?
Mhm.
That is so disgusting. First, to describe this as a sin. This is a harm to a child that we're talking about. But we can see the way that the church presupposes its own belief system and thinks. Here's the reality of the statistics: people don't recover from being a pedophile. They oftentimes do not change. That's the reality.
That's
I
right.
think the statistics bear out that most abusers are only caught after they've abused multiple children.
Yep.
That's only usually when it comes to light. That's not true in every case, but it is the statistical reality.
Just like DUIs.
Just like DUIs, it's usually like your 8th DUI. Statistics say that you actually get charged with your first DUI. So why in the world does the church want to create a system, according to FAIR, that helps these people who are child abusers? That's the term. They're not sinners, they're child abusers, have the confidence that they won't have legal action taken against them. They should have legal action taken against them.
They should be scared to death of legal action.
This is so disgusting. This is what happens when an institution thinks it's above reproach, is it thinks that it can come up and parrot stuff like this that any morally normal person would be flipping tables over. That line that you read is so disgusting, and it's exactly why I'm disgusted by people like Jennifer Roach. She should know better, and she should know, based on her expertise, that the problem is she's not prioritizing her expertise. She's prioritizing her Mormon identity. And if she were prioritizing her expertise, she would be just as disgusted as any other morally normal person out there.
And we've seen this time and time and time again. It's an old story of people who have a profession and certain ethics and certain obligations that go with that profession, compromising them again and again and again if they're members of the church. As what do you say? They're focusing on their identity as a Mormon.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. And therefore, they will cut corners and make allowances for and contravene their own internal morals and their professional ethics as well.
And remember the overall statement here that we're going to look at in depth. The church does not tolerate abuse. That's what it says every time one of these. Sorry, go ahead, Elsie.
Well, that's what they say, but they're extremely tolerant.
That's what I was going to say. The very quote you just read from Fair Mormon is an apologetic on how and why they think it's justifiable to tolerate abuse, because they're saying they want to help people who have sinned have confidence that disclosing sins to the bishop will not automatically result in legal action. How about you have a little bit less tolerance for the abusers and a little bit more concern about the survivors and the victims?
And this is what always happens. And this is what's happened in the church. There's so much focus, and I know Elsie has a great slide on this later. I think you do. About well, I made them based upon your paper.
Okay.
So I consider them your slides. But about this idea that there is all of this attention given to the perpetrator, and all of this forgiveness, and all taking out to dinners, right, Colby? All the attention goes to the perpetrator as a Christian outpouring of love and mercy, and the victim gets left alone in the dark. If they're lucky. If they're not lucky, then the victim is brought into it and told that the victim needs to forgive the perpetrator.
Yeah. And can I add something when you mentioned the forgiveness factor?
Yeah.
As an adult, when I got ready, the pre-temple interview, when you go to your bishop first and you hit the stake president, right? I'm talking with the bishop, and I'm a grown adult at this point, and I asked him the question that had plagued me for years. Does what happened when I was a kid affect my worthiness to be sealed to my husband? And I guess in a way I was very fortunate in that the bishop I had at the time was military, and being a Navy man himself, he went through training and all this kind of stuff through the military, which is totally different from what the Mormon Church was doing. And he looked at me and he said, well, you'd have to find out if the statute of limitations ran out in the state in which it took place. And at the time, my father was still alive. I'll mention that too. And he said, and what he did was wrong, and you were just a kid, so it has no bearing on you. However, you may want to go to the stake president in his area and tell them about it so they can excommunicate your father and he can start his life all over again. Now, what's wrong with that picture?
Mm-hmm.
Well, aside from the fact that at that point I wasn't ready to do something like that, I did later on confront him, but I wasn't ready at that point. There's the issue of, gee, mom's going to find out, my siblings, total embarrassment for the whole family. Do I really want all that on my shoulders right now? Or do I just want to go to the temple? So I told him, I asked him, could I think about it? And he said, of course you can. And it was never brought up again. But
Elsie,
so much,
Elsie,
huh?
can I ask you a
Yes.
question? I'm
Yes,
sorry,
sir.
you go ahead and finish your story. My question is going to end up being, is what you're describing actually an argument against mandatory reporting?
No, it's not. It's in favor of mandatory reporting
Because it's putting the
because
kid on the spot, right?
yeah,
Before the kid is
and
ready
well,
to reveal.
that's why it's important to understand that bishops are usually not the ones that people disclose to until they're adults. That's my point.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go to the bishop as an adult, the response is, well, you need to get that person excommunicated or at least disfellowship so they can get back in the good graces of God again. That is a hard thing for an adult to do. And that was my point, is that I couldn't do it. I
Mm-hmm.
can't imagine if they tell somebody younger, a teenager or somebody, that they have to go walk this adult who abused them through some kind of church discipline process, and that it's up to them to help this person.
Yes.
That's not a good way to deal with it. You see my point in this?
Mm-hmm. That you are in some way responsible for initiating this
Yeah.
when you're not ready to.
And I wasn't ready to. Later on, I was ready to, but I did it my way, and
Mm-hmm.
not the Mormon way. Of course, I
Yeah.
would.
Let me ask Colby. Colby, obviously, this mandatory reporting thing, we're not going to do a whole episode about mandatory reporting, but we do recognize that there are good arguments on both sides of the issue, do we?
Well, I think every argument I've heard against mandatory reporting largely is the result of cultural difficulties in dealing with this issue. So, in my view, I don't view any of those arguments as being problematic if we can increase the public's general awareness of how serious and damaging child abuse is, how prevalent it is, what it looks like. So, in my view, I am a strong proponent of mandatory reporting, but I'll acknowledge that there are certain difficulties that the system causes for kids when they're in that situation. So I don't view the potential drawbacks as intractable problems, I guess is the way I would put it,
Yeah.
Arfin. You're
Whoops.
muted, sir.
You got to stop saying that. I know I got to stop doing that, but you got to stop saying that. Otherwise, I'm going to have to go back and edit this stuff out. I know I'm muted, damn it. You don't have to keep saying it. But
Well, I think
the legitimate questions,
oh,
Elsie,
sorry.
the
Yeah, go ahead.
legitimate arguments that are not in the tank for the perpetrator, right? Okay. But the legitimate arguments, I consider them legitimate because they're looking out for the welfare of the child. That
Mhm.
the arguments on both sides do focus on the welfare of the child. I just wanted to point that out. Elsie, go ahead.
Yeah, I think once a child discloses or once a teenager talks, I think it's from that point on that the adults have to take over and be the adults in the room. And that's why I support the idea of people like bishops, pastors, priests, whatever, being mandatory reporters. If somebody comes to a bishop and says, say it's a 12-year-old girl comes to the bishop and says, so and so did thus and such, it's not up to the bishop to investigate.
No.
That's not his job.
Right.
It's his job to turn that information over to the proper authorities and, as much as possible, let the 12-year-old live her life as normal as she possibly can and take steps to protect the child.
Yes.
That's what the adults do. Unfortunately, LDS policy oftentimes drags the children through it with it.
Yes.
And it should not.
Yes. Now, I will say that in your example, right, it doesn't always happen that the bishop's going to report that to the police when the 12-year-old girl
Right.
comes to him and makes a disclosure. The issue is, of course, not when the 12-year-old girl comes to the bishop. It's when the perpetrator comes to the bishop and tells
Okay.
him in a confessional setting behind the closed door that this is what happened and confessing. And that's the issue then about the mandatory reporting, right? And whether that should be required then. I would hope that we would all agree that if
I
the
think he
12-year-old
needs
girl
to
comes to
still
him, that should be
report it. I
mandatorily
don't think
reported.
there should be any hesitation in reporting it. And in actuality, one of the things I will tell you that the SBC does is they have pastors. If somebody comes in and they say, I've molested my daughter, the first thing the pastor should say is, you've got your choice. Either I can take you to the police department or we can have them come here and get you. Which do you prefer?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and to your point, RFM, the question, are there legitimate reasons to have some caution about full mandatory reporting statutes? There are arguments that go to that, but none of them are none of the legitimate ones are the argument we're reading here from FAIR's website, probably written by or something that Jennifer Roach would approve of. I'm just going to guess, since she's done work for them on this issue, that we need to care about abusers having confidence that disclosing the sin will automatically result in legal action. None of the arguments in favor of, well, maybe we should be very careful about thinking through the implications of mandatory reporting or what are on offer here. These are just reactionary arguments to defend, like you said, the church's status quo against any changes.
Okay.
Can
Very
we get
good.
to the helpline one?
We will.
Okay. Because
You're
I've got
excited to get
until
to the helpline.
12:45.
I'm sorry, what?
I've got until 12:45.
So
I've got
how much
another
longer do you
20
have then?
minutes. Huh?
How much
I've
longer do
got
you have?
12:30 now.
She has
The
20 minutes.
helpline.
Why
I
don't
have
we
this.
do the helpline and as much as we can, and then we can push through RFM? I don't know. I'm good to go.
Okay, so in other words, Elsie, we'll take you through to your deadline and focus on your stuff. So the helpline,
Okay.
and Colby will stay and we'll go through his stuff. Right? Perfect. The
Okay.
helpline, lay church leaders around the world do not necessarily have the training and background necessary to handle cases of abuse. The church has a hotline. Now, once again, they don't have the training because they're part-time and they're not given sufficient training.
Yeah.
But in order to make up the deficiency, they don't get them more training or more adequate training. Instead, they establish a phone. The church has a hotline with trained experts who can provide information and support for the church leader and the victim. LC.
That is a blatant lie. And I know that myself because I called the number. I went to the website. This was in January of 2025, so not so long ago. I called the number. And what I got was a very, very nice lady. And I asked her, I said, is this the church helpline if you've been abused? And she says, well, no, ma'am, this is the church headquarters that leaders, bishops, and such can use to report cases of abuse and talk to attorneys. So
And
I'm
talk
not
to
sure how
attorneys?
that's a helpline.
And
I
talk to
call it
attorneys.
and talk to attorneys. It's the helpline to nowhere.
It's the helpline to help the church.
It's the helpline to nowhere for the victims. That what they said, what he is saying here is a blatant lie, and either he never called the number to find out who was on the other end, or he's just guessing and hoping that he's right. I don't know. But the bottom line is it doesn't help the victim. There's nothing there to help the victim. If you say you're a victim, they're not going to let you even talk to the attorneys. Who would I have talked to if she had put me through an attorney? And she wouldn't have put me through because I wasn't a bishop or a stake president or something like that.
It is the
So,
bishop or stake president who talks to the attorneys. It is not the victim.
right. It's not the victim. So why he said that, other than delusion or lie, I don't know. But it's mind-boggling to me that they even put that in there. And then when you go to the LDS website itself, and it talks about, the helpline, blah, blah, blah. It offers all kinds of non-LDS resources for victims. Okay. And they're all good resources now. Okay. But notice the church dang got their own. They don't have their own. That's because they don't have qualified people. Not that they couldn't pay for these people to become qualified, but they don't have qualified counselors. They don't have a counseling line of trained people to help victims. Instead, they refer them out. However, if an offender goes in, then the bishop is told he should seek to understand the offender, ask certain questions of the offender, make sure the offender's understanding that they should want to repent and yada, yada. It never says in those things, though, are you ready to go to jail? That's not one of the questions.
Elsie, what were you reading off of?
Just now, I was reading my own notes. But
Well, where did you get that from?
My notes or
your notes? Because I know it comes from a church source. I'm just trying to get you to tell us what the church source is you're quoting.
Okay. From. The church source is the LDS website, where it talks about abuse and how bishops should handle it. It's in the handbook.
And it's all about how the bishop should deal with
it says,
the perpetrator, not with the victim.
Okay, I'll try to make this make sense a little bit, because they sent me all over Robin Hood's barn on this. In order to find information, I'm just going to read what I wrote because it's from my website. In order to find information, I found myself going through a maze. Oh, hold on a second. This thing is not cooperating. Going through a maze on the website. Eventually, I found the page In Crisis, Talk Now. It circled back to the Counseling Resources page. All of the clickable help numbers were non-LDS. The church doesn't seem qualified to assist those who have been victims, either with counseling, emergency housing, etc. Interestingly, if you click on the abuse offender link, you find the church encouraging bishops, who, by the way, are not qualified to help victims, but are apparently suddenly capable of having a discourse with the offender.
Boom.
They are asked to seek to understand the offender. But you just tell this other person, call the hotline, 800-888, whatever.
Somebody
talk to a
else's
total
hotline.
stranger. Yeah.
That's such a powerful point. That's why I wanted you to read that, which is that the materials for the church to the bishop in these situations is all about how he relates to the perpetrator and not the victim. All right, so let me go to the next one. Number 8. Now we're out of that list. We're out of the Jennifer Roach thing. Now we're back just to no, actually, I'm sorry. This is another line out of the helpline. I apologize. Lay church leaders around the world do not necessarily have the training and background necessary to handle cases of abuse. I think you handled that. Number 9. Now we're out of that list. But shouldn't children and youth have a trusted adult to talk to if something is wrong at home? He's putting forward the bishop, obviously. Or at school. How much abuse has been stopped or prevented through the church's semi-annual interview program?
We don't know, because they don't keep track of it. They don't keep track of how many young people go to their bishop and say, I'm sorry, bishop, but my so-and-so. I think we had this discussion the other day, but I'm just going to read from this. According to studies, in particular one entitled Adult and Adolescent Disclosure of Child Sexual Abuse, teenage victims are very rarely disclosed to any adult. Instead, they disclose to peers. I raised 5 teenagers, 4 boys and a girl. There were things they might talk to me about, but I know that most of the time they were talking to their peers. Mm-hmm. And, I kind of got lucky in that their peers would say, you need to talk to your mom. She's pretty cool. She'll understand. But that doesn't always happen, let alone go to a bishop who's going to decide whether or not you're worthy. And I don't know if Miss Roach and Mr. Fife understand this, but those interviews are not there to determine who's being abused and who isn't. They're
Right.
not there to ask the personal questions that could make a big difference in a child's life and safety. They're there to determine if the kid is worthy enough to go on and do whatever it is that the kid wants to do in the church. Whether it's go do baptisms for the dead, whether it's get baptized, period, whatever it is, they go through this and a bishop decides, okay, they understand it and they're worthy enough to do it. That's all those are. Those are not, sit down counseling, probing sessions.
Right.
I went through way too many of them to believe that. Plus, there's the added issue. The online database that we oftentimes talk about lists 4,025 reports of alleging sexual abuse going on in the Mormon Church. Of that list,
when you say database, you mean this is Floodlit?
Floodlit, yeah. Of that list, there are 583 cases involving bishops, and of that list, 67 were offending at the time they held the office of bishop. 99.5% of those cases involved children and minors. So we're going to go to the guy who might molest me and tell him what again?
Yeah, what's going on at home?
You know what? I'm going to try and make this as quick as possible, but I wish they'd just do away with those stupid things. If
The
you
bishop
can't,
interviews?
yeah, for adults, kids, I don't care. Do away with the whole thing. And the reason I say that is part of faith, and I'm going to say this as a faith person. Part of faith is realizing that there is something very intimate between you and your relationship with God that should never be breached unless there's a darn good reason, like you're molesting a kid. Okay? But in terms of whether you drink coffee or not, whether you're smoking or not, which everyone could smell on you if you are, whether all of these non-ridiculous things that the LDS God is offended by. That I'm sorry, but it's true. He's the most easily offended God I've ever met. All of those things should be left up to individuals. Tithing should be left up to individuals. I thought for the very first time I went to a Christian church, a regular, normal Christian church, the very first time I went to one, I was pretty convinced that I'd be hearing from that pastor because I only put $5 in that plate. Okay. I never heard from anybody. And in all the years that I've been going to a Southern Baptist church, not one pastor has ever approached me about how much I tithe. And the only time you get anything of reference to your tithing is for your income tax. Nobody calls you aside and interrogates you about your tithing. Nobody calls you aside and interrogates you about your smoking. And God forbid at a Baptist social, if you don't have coffee, they think you're mental.
And so people who don't know, in the Mormon Church, you have a meeting once a year with the bishop, usually in December, toward the end of the year, which is exclusively to make sure that you are paying your tithing honestly, an honest tithing. Yeah, Mormons are very, very into policing conformity with their commandments.
And they should not be, if they trust that their God knows everything, which they say they believe. Can't you trust your membership to do what's right? And
no.
to,
that is one thing the Mormon leadership will never trust its
you can't.
membership to do, because
And
it's a
do you
little
know
bit of
what
projection.
do you know what that falls under the heading of? Cults.
Projection? What?
No, cults.
Cults.
C-U-L-T-S. Cults.
No.
Cults,
See you
you
last
exercise that much personal control. They
You're
will
right.
exercise that much personal control. It's like the member number ID. Which ward can you go to? I could walk out of the church I go to now and go to the one down the street. They'll miss me, I hope. But and I'll run into members who'll say, "Where you been? I missed you." That kind of thing. But I'm not going to have a knock on my door going, "What do you mean going to that church down there?" I'm not going to have someone tell me what church I can or cannot go to. That was not from the beginning, and it's not now. And the Mormon Church has taken that whole aspect of gathering together and turned it into a control factor. And you see that in cult groups all the time.
Not to hurry you, but there's 13
Yeah.
of these. And number 10 is the quote
Sorry.
from Austin Fife: "The painful reality is that our children and youth in the Mormon Church are far more likely to experience abuse at home or school or even in other churches than they are to experience it in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." Elsie.
There he goes again. That's I don't know what else to say. There he goes again. They don't even have appropriate training for this. I mean, I could actually recommend, and I did on my blog. You saw the recommendation to the leadership that I wrote. I think you read that much.
I read it all.
They've got so many programs out there that the Mormon Church could confiscate and actually use that might actually help in this situation more than what they've got at their disposal. So I will disagree with him and say it's not going to happen more in other churches, except for the fact that other churches are bigger. I mean, you
And
know,
yet he's still keying off this main data point that
yeah.
most abuse happens in the home. So
And
yeah, it's far
I,
more likely to experience abuse at home than in
right.
the LDS church. But the question is, so what?
So
What does
yeah,
that have to do with the
that's my
point you're
thing. So
making?
what? Did
And
that
why
make
is
it
it
any
then that if the church were to put cameras in to reduce child
right?
abuse further than whatever that rate is,
Well, and
why
if they would
wouldn't that
change
be a
how
good
they
thing?
handle it, then it happening more at home, even in their own ranks, wouldn't matter so much. You got to handle it differently. You got to deal with the problem. And I get the impression that they don't want to really deal with it. Remember, I used that phrase the other day, symbolism over substance. They
Yes.
want to make it look like they're doing something without really doing anything.
Yes, and any church could make this exact same statement in defense, unless they happen to be the one that was at the very, very apex of churches that have the most child molestation. Any
Which,
other
yeah.
church, and you can twist the stats to make that true, but
But there are
or make it untrue.
there
Any
are
church
so
could say this.
many good programs out there that were developed with the help of law enforcement. I can name some: ministrysafe.com. These are all religious based. They should have no problem with this. The ecap.net, Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention, protectmyministry.com, safeguardfromabuse.com/churches. That one deals with churches, schools, you name it. He says he felt lied to by critics who wanted to convince him that abuse is widespread and rampant in the church. Before I go, I want to say something here. I feel lied to, and so do so many other people who were abused by worthy elders, bishops, whatevers. We felt lied to because we were told that we were safe because the people around us were worthy and they were called by God. We were told they had authority and we could trust it. He thinks he was lied to. He wasn't lied to. They were telling the truth to him, but he wants to think he was lied to and make himself out a victim. And I'm going to say this right now, Mr. Fife, if you're listening, take the bullet out of your pocket and start looking closely at what's really going on. And for God's sakes, listen to some victims. I'm sorry, RFM. I do need to get going.
Thankful so much for your time. You've given us a lot more than we had originally scheduled. Thank you so much, Elsie. Really, really
Thank you for
appreciate it.
having me on. And it's nice to meet you too there, Corby. You're great guys. Thank you so much for what you're doing on this.
Thank you very much. Have a great day, and we will
You
just
too.
continue on for a few more minutes after you're gone
Okay.
and cover a couple more points. Thanks, Elsie.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow, that was absolutely fantastic. I just knew there was going to be too much to get through, and I may have stalled us on a couple of points, so I'll take responsibility for that. Let's go back to this. This is number 11. Quote from Austin Fife: "How much abuse has been stopped or prevented through the church's semi-annual interview program?" We already commented on that, and so did Elsie, and that's good. And the answer is we got no idea, but probably very little, if any. Okay, it's a rhetorical question that's designed for impact. There's nothing behind it. It doesn't advance his argument at all. It's whataboutism.
If they wanted to make the semi-annual interview program part of preventing abuse, then they probably need to have a training with leaders about how to recognize the markers of abuse, because what they're relying on is, and Elsie blasted a hole in the logic behind it, is they're relying on these children to come forward and outrightly say, I've been abused.
Yes.
Because otherwise, without the training of the things to look for, like other mandatory reporters receive, like teachers, doctors, that's all they're expecting, is for children to come out and outright say, I'm being abused at home and here's what's happening. And the bottom line is that's not never, but that's very rarely going to happen according to the statistics.
Yes. Number 12, quote, will there always be some instance where a local ward or state volunteer leader did not do enough to protect the victims? So I'm not sure what kind of argument this is, but it's pretty worthless. Sadly, yes. In other words, there's always going to be times when they don't do enough. But is that an excuse for not doing the obvious things that other churches are doing that they could be doing in order to protect their kids? He goes on, however, any shortcoming among our members and leaders is in spite of, not because of, the church and its teachings and practices. And once again, the Catholic Church could say the same damn thing. That any shortcoming among the Catholic members and Catholic leaders is in spite of the church, the Catholic Church's teachings and practices. It's not because of them. I don't know of any churches that promote child sex abuse among its members and leaders.
Right.
So any child sex abuse that happens, and it does happen in all churches, is going to be in spite of, not because of, that particular church and its teachings or practices. So I see this as a tautology. It's meaningless. What do you think?
I think not only is it meaningless, but when we get to the records that I prepared on the Bisby case, you will see that the judge literally says it is because of the church's doctrine and practices, the result that ultimately happened in that case. So I want people to remember this phrase that Austin is saying any shortcoming among members and leaders is in spite of, not because of, the church and its teachings and practices, because not according to the judge in the Bisby case.
Wow. Well, we went through 13, so let's get right to that. Here's the record you've got for us in the Bisby case. Take us through it, Colby.
I do. I just wanted to orient people. So I'm largely going to cover material that I've shared on Reddit before. So this is the Reddit write-up that I'm pulling these resources from. The title of that piece there, you can see the church's recurring statement that abuse of any kind is not tolerated in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a demonstrable lie. And in that Reddit post, I wrote it about 1.5 years ago. I walked through 3 specific data points, the first one being the Bisby case and the judge's decision in the Bisby case dismissing the case. The second being some reporting on our local case. And the third, so I'm going to go through both of those. The third that's covered in that piece, I actually don't have slides prepared for. While I'm doing that, I wanted to point people to Floodlit, this database that we've referred to multiple times, Elsie referred to multiple times. It's a fantastic resource that can use people's support. I believe it's a husband and wife couple. I don't know their identities, like their real life identities, but we talk pretty constantly on Reddit about files that they're looking at and cases that they're looking at. This is just kind of their landing page. So as Elsie shared, there's over 4,000 reports of sexual abuse cases in the church. You can see 603 sex offenders, 70 convicted former bishops, 74 ongoing criminal cases, 118 ongoing civil lawsuits, and $51 million in payments after alleged failures.
And that is a very, very small amount of the actual number, because usually they are not subject to being disclosed. So we don't know how much those payments are. It's going to be so much more than 51 million, obviously.
Exactly. On the right-hand side, I just kind of pulled they have like a section on their homepage that has like the most recent news. And so just to my point of how recurrent, because remember, if you go back to 13 for just 1 second.
Oh, I'm so sorry. The next one. Yes, go ahead.
So Austin says, I felt lied to by critics who wanted to convince me that abuse is widespread and rampant in the church. Let's go forward again. So here there's breaking news of Mormon Church loses civil lawsuit against insurance companies on April 11th, yesterday. There's other news on a wave of over 100 Mormon sex abuse lawsuits continuing in California from 3 days before that. The next update was Scott Owen, an abuser that abused someone local to me, that has reached out to me and very bravely worked to have Scott Owen convicted. That was reported on March 31st. The last update before that was March 27th. There was a separate update on March 27th, breaking news on March 25th, breaking news before that on March 25th, and breaking news before that on March 21st. My point is just, Austin is trying to say that people who are trying to bring the public's awareness of this issue and the prevalence of this issue are lying or are trying to paint him into a corner. But it's pretty hard to take that seriously when I just gave you 10 updates in less than a month that involve the church and the church's sex abuse reporting.
Right. So in other words, he feels lied to. This is his last line, I think, in his chapter.
Right.
I felt lied to by the critics who wanted to convince me that abuse is widespread and rampant in the church. Well, he's engaging in straw manning and saying it's everywhere. No, nobody's saying it's everywhere, literally, but there's an awful lot of it, and it needs to be dealt with in an effective way instead of just waving platitudes at it and otherwise ignoring that it's going on.
Exactly. So let's talk about the Bisby case. If you'll go forward one more slide, I've pulled, this is the judge's ruling dismissing the Bisby case, which is on appeal now. So we're not exactly sure how it will shake out ultimately. But this dismissal ruling from the judge has been appealed and is under consideration. I just wanted to highlight a high-level overview of the Bisby case for people who don't remember when it was reported back in 2022 by Mike Resendez, the same individual who participated with the Boston Globe team on the Spotlight team in the movie Spotlight. Here's kind of a two-sentence overview of the case. So it took place in Bisby, Arizona, where Paul Adams sexually abused his daughters over several years, even recording and sharing his abuse online, which is how he was ultimately discovered by Department of Homeland Security. Despite confessing the abuse to LDS Church bishops, yes, bishops, there were two involved, the abuse was never reported to authorities, allegedly due to advice from the church's legal helpline, leading to a lawsuit against the church for failing to act. And so what I wanted to highlight is this is from a section of the opinion where it says Paul Adams confessed to Herod, that's one of the bishops, John Herod, that he had sexually abused Jane Doe number 1. That was the first victim, daughter.
That's his daughter. Yeah.
Correct. Herod and Miss Adams attend a second session with Mr. Adams, and Herod had Mr. Adams tell Miss Adams about the abuse. Herod provided counseling to Mr. and Miss Adams.
So the bishop makes the perpetrator confess to his wife.
Correct. Herod provided counseling to Mr. and Miss Adams and either said that Mr. Adams should turn himself in to the authorities, or he may have said Miss Adams should turn him in. Herod left his post in 2012, and he disclosed the abuse of Jane Doe 1 to the new bishop, Kim Mauzy. Mr. Adams was excommunicated from the church in 2013 after a disciplinary council proceeding. What I wanted to do in the next several slides is I wanted to compare and contrast the church's position, because it was the church's motion for summary judgment that ultimately resulted in this order that we're reading from the judge. For people who are unaware, you know this, but in a summary judgment motion, the facts are largely going to either have to be stipulated to or they cannot be contested. If relevant facts are contested, summary judgment is not appropriate. And so what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to highlight the difference between the way the church presents its positions on this case in court versus how it presents its actions in this case to its members and the public in press releases. So
Okay.
if you will move forward to the next case, or to the next slide, I'm sorry. This is one of the rare cases I know of where the church did not just one press release, but two separate press releases because it was getting so many questions and so much pushback on this particular case. So you can see there, I pulled this from the church's website, the 17th of August, 2022. Mike Resendez broke the story on August 1st of 2022, if I remember correctly. So the church does a first release, press release, which there's a lot of pushback to. This is then the second press release. And you can see there underneath the headline, well, I haven't read the headline, I'm sorry. It says, Church provides further details about the Arizona abuse case. Church outlines its feelings on abuse and how a recent Associated Press story got it wrong. And so I want to just highlight, this is from a section of this press release where the church is highlighting the way it paints the facts. So do you want to read that that paragraph there, RFM?
So basically, the church is going to say two things. We don't like child sex abuse, which they always say. And who does? I mean, is somebody going to raise their hand and say we're in favor of child sex abuse? No,
Right.
Nobody's going to do that. Of course, they're going to do that.
Right.
So that's the first thing. And the second thing they're going to do is they're going to engage in this puerile apologetic tactic of trying to say what it is that the AP article got wrong.
Right.
Without taking any responsibility for what it was they did. So here's what it says. In late 2011, this is the church's statement, Paul Adams, the bad guy, made a limited confession to his bishop about a single past incident, Can you see the minimizing going on? It's a limited confession. It's about a single past incident. As if, what, we need 2 or 3 or more to make it important enough to call the cops?
Yeah.
About a
Disgusting.
single past incident of abuse of one child. One child. There's 3 minimizations in that one sentence. Limited, single, and one.
Right.
The bishop then called the helpline, which he is told he needs to do, where he was advised about how to fully comply with Arizona's reporting laws. Bullshit. That's a lie. And the reason I say that is because the Arizona reporting law gives the discretion to the bishop.
Oh, we're going to get there. We're going to get there.
All right. In compliance with that counsel from the attorney that is paid for by the church to monitor this phone line and give these kinds of answers to bishops like this bishop calling about these kinds of issues, he was fully advised about how to fully comply with Arizona's reporting laws. In compliance with that counsel, from that time forward, the bishop repeatedly tried to intervene and encourage reporting, including by, I take it none of these are going to be by picking up the phone and calling the cops himself.
Correct.
No, including counseling Paul Adams to repent and seek professional help. Okay. So in other words, you give all the power to the perpetrator.
Right.
Brilliant. Asking Paul Adams to report, he refused and also refused to give permission to the bishop to make the report. Well, what a surprise.
Right.
You've got a child molester who refuses to turn himself into the cops and refuses to give the bishop permission to turn him into. Encouraging. So the bishop also encouraging Paul Adams' wife to report. Okay, so somebody's got to report. Will you report? No. Okay, wife, will you report? Oh, she doesn't report. Oh, I guess we throw up our hands and leave the kids to the mercy of the wolves then. What other answer is there, Colby? Well, pick up the phone, damn it, you bishop. And one of you, Herod, was a freaking medical doctor at the time, who I hope has suffered some kind of impact on his medical license for this, because he, Herod, if he's the medical doctor, contravened his medical ethics, his freaking ethics for the church. And it's just another example of how people will sacrifice whatever it is they know to be right, plus their own professional ethics, even a medical doctor, for the church. Because some faceless lawyer at the end of a telephone line told him this. Sorry, I get a little bit upset about this.
I'm loving it.
But that's not all the bishop did. He did more stuff. He encouraged Paul Adams to move out of the home. Once again, move out of the home. Well, I did it temporarily. Now I'm back in. Okay, well, you have all the power, obviously, so you can move back in.
I'd also note that what he did, which he did temporarily, I'm not sure if this is with the benefit of hindsight, but that suggests that the church as an institution understood that this person then moved back into the home and didn't do a goddamn thing about it.
Yes. And honestly, this is terrible because the church is trying to use this as a defense and justification that what they did was appropriate, right?
Right.
So he asked him to move out of the house and he did. Oh, but then he moved back in. But that's in parentheses, urging his wife to seek professional counseling for her husband, Paul, and their children, which would trigger a mandatory report. Oh, they refused. Well, you know why they refused? Because it would trigger a mandatory report.
Right.
And so
because
once
of
again, that
that,
gets the whole mandatory reporting argument, right?
and for people who remember the timeline, the AP original headline was 7 years of sex abuse, how the Mormon Church's Helpline helped it happen, or something to that effect. This continued for years and years, and we'll read the statement. I've read it before with you, but we're going to read that statement again from Liza Adams' sentencing judge, because the fact that the church hasn't been held to account for this more is insane to me. When you
Yes.
understand the facts of this case and how involved the church was, because remember, we're reading this paragraph now because the church, in that initial bullet point that you read, they are trying to distance themselves from Paul Adams. They're trying to say he's not a true Mormon. That's what they're really trying to do. They're trying to distance from him, and they're trying to get away from the bishop's involvement because of what it will do to the church's civil liability. And
Yes.
I just want to point out even how contradictory this paragraph that you've been reading from is, because they're trying to paint this all as it was a limited confession. It was a limited thing. We didn't really know. Look at how much action these bishops took. Like, the church can't have it both ways on this. Either they were intimately involved by doing all of these things, tracking where this individual lived, or they weren't involved. And you'll see if you look at the last bullet point, I highlighted again, they're trying to minimize. Prior to and after his limited confession, Paul rarely attended church or talked to church leaders.
Mhm.
That seems completely contradictory, since they just gave us a list of 5 items where these leaders are trying to, without doing the basic obvious thing of calling the freaking police, they're trying to get involved in this family's life and trying to encourage the abuser and the person who's absolutely complicit in this abuse to solve the problem themselves. The church can't have it both ways on this.
Right. And whereas all 5 of these bullet points could have happened in one meeting, that's not the way it's being portrayed, because they want it to look like the church was really involved before they say, oh, well, he didn't really come out to church much or talk to leaders after his limited confession. By the way, it also says in 2013, Adams was excommunicated for his behavior and lost his membership in the church. We know what excommunication means. Why did it take till 2013? I wonder, because I know that another child, Jane Doe 2, was born, his second daughter, whom he started abusing as well. And because it took, why did it take so long for them to excommunicate him after his initial limited confession 2 years earlier, Colby? Do we know that?
I have no idea.
Okay. All right. Well, then let's go ahead and go to the next one. Are you ready?
Yep. Let's go to the next slide. It's actually it's a repeat of the first slide.
Oh,
but
you didn't want that one?
I just want to drive home the difference, right? So the court, and I guess here's the question for you, RFM. Why are the pictures between what the church has to admit to in court, their involvement of multiple bishops, multiple meetings, why is it so different from the church's press release? Say, may it be because the attorneys that represent the church have a duty of candor to the court and would be responsible for professional malpractice and ethical violations if they misled the court? That's
yes.
my
Well,
point.
also the victims have the chance too,
right,
to weigh in a
Right.
court proceeding.
Right.
So you're saying that this is very different. So let me see here. So this is what's in the court order, granting summary judgment for the church, but even so, talking about the stipulated facts. In other words, the church had to agree to these facts.
Right.
Paul Adams confessed to Herod, the bishop, that he had sexually abused Jane Doe 1, his first daughter. Herod had Ms. Adams, the wife,
right? A
What?
second session. Herod had Miss Adams attend a second session. So
Thank you.
already the church said this was a limited confession of a single instance of abuse of a single child. And we can already see a second session. So we can already see that they were more involved than the church is representing it.
Well, if the bishop has the perpetrator, Mr. Adams, meet in the bishop's office with his wife so that the perpetrator will confess it to his wife at the bishop's direction, that's a second confession
Mm-hmm.
in front of the bishop. So I see what you're saying. So in other words, what really happened, what the church agreed in court happened, is so much worse and actually contradictory in some ways to what the church press release stated.
Exactly. And it also shows the level of involvement here, not just on the part of one bishop, because that's often the apologetic excuse we hear when one of these cases is mishandled, right? We hear, oh, well, there's always going to be bad apples. No, this issue is systemic. There were two different bishops involved. There was a lawyer involved in another state that worked directly for the church. So let's go. If you'll go to the next slide, these are additional portions of the judge's order. So what I've done is I've interlineated my commentary and then the parts from the judge's order that I'm talking about, which are in italics for people to differentiate if they're looking at the slides as we go through them. So it says the judge's order continues.
What is that? Is that a cracker?
It was bread.
Are you having the sacrament with beer?
This is a kombucha, so close enough.
I used to drink that. It's kind of really gross in sort of a good way.
That is the perfect description.
Okay, the judge's order. Okay, I'm sorry, that's you.
Okay. So, going back to the judge's order. The judge's order continues. Bishop Herod contacted legal counsel for the church and was advised that he could only encourage Mr. Adams to turn himself in and that it was illegal for him to report the abuse. So we now know, so this is back to my commentary, not the judge's order. We now know that this advice, which I'll spend a moment to lay out, is blatantly incorrect and is discussed in the video interview above too. I pulled this from my Reddit post where I must have shared an interview where I talked about this. That incorrect advice came from former Utah State Representative and Curtin McConkie lawyer Merrill Nelson. Mike Resendez followed up about this too, so people can look up his story. According to court filings, so back to the judge's order, Nelson advised Bishop John Herod not to report the abuse and told him, quote, that he could be sued if he reported, and the instruction by counsel not to report Paul to the authorities was the law in Arizona. And here's the real money shot here, and had nothing to do with church doctrine, okay? The mandatory reporting statute at issue, I told you we would get to that, is Arizona Statute 133620 Cap A, and it's cited in the court's decision. And the court continues, the court also finds it not relevant that Herod said the helpline told him he was not allowed to report the child abuse, instead of advising him he was not required to report it. So that was that distinction that you were talking about earlier, which is these mandatory reporting exemptions are always optional based upon the doctrine and policy of the church at issue. This next line, I think, really drives home the point here. Plaintiffs are correct that it would not have been illegal under Arizona law for Herod to report the abuse, but it would have violated church doctrine. Therefore, he was not required to make a report.
And the plaintiffs here, of course, are the victims who are suing the church.
Correct. And what I want to remind people of is that statement from Austin Fife. Any shortcoming among our members and leaders is in spite of, not because of, the church and its teachings and practices. Well, Austin, not according to this judge, which was accepting the arguments of the church itself. It would have violated church doctrine. Therefore, he was not required to make a report.
Right. Because obviously it wasn't a violation of the law.
Exactly.
All right. Very good point.
So here are some statements from the church's section on their website regarding abuse, which I think Elsie was reading from a little bit earlier. Abuse is the mistreatment or neglect of others in a way that causes physical, emotional, or sexual harm. The church's position is that abuse cannot be tolerated in any form, and that those who abuse will be accountable for God. It's really that point that the church says that abuse cannot be tolerated in any form that I'm trying to drive home here is the demonstrable lie based on the facts of this case and honestly a dozen others. I just picked this one because I know the facts of this one really well.
Yeah, it really is like the church leaders are saying, I'm shocked to find out there's child molestation going on in the church.
Mm-hmm. And I also want people to contrast that with the second quote I have from the church's website from that same section on abuse, where they say victims of abuse may find comfort in seeking spiritual guidance and support from church leaders as they heal. And here's the very important part. The first responsibility of church leaders is to help those who have been abused and protect those who may be vulnerable to future abuse.
The
That
first
is,
responsibility?
that's what they say on their website. This is again where the reality of the aspiration on the church's website isn't really tracked with reality. The reality in these cases, like we talked about in detail with Elsie, is the church and its leaders are often prioritizing the repentant or the confessor or the sinner, the abuser, over the children. They're not following through with this first responsibility to help those who have been abused and to protect those who may be vulnerable to future abuse.
Where is this from? Because this next line that you have a highlight on at the top of the right is an absolute bald-faced lie. So where is this coming from?
So what's on the right is going back to that press release relating to this case in particular. So this is again from that second press release from the 17th of August, 2022. And if you'd like to read that, I'm all for it.
So the church is behind this. The church authorized this and sanctioned this statement.
Correct.
Okay, so here's what the church says, folks, about itself. The church's abuse helpline has everything to do with protecting children and has nothing to do with cover-up.
Let me just pause you right there. So based on what we've just read already from the judge's order, from what we know about this case, this is a press release issued in response to this particular case. How in the world can the church claim that with the facts of this case, RFM?
It was used to cover up the abuse. Well, it was used to protect the church, which also involves covering up the abuse. You've got a bishop in Arizona calling a lawyer in Salt Lake City for the church, asking if he needs to report. What do I need to do? This guy just reported he's been abusing his kid. The lawyer, who has access to all the statutes in all the states, presumably looks up Arizona, reads it, and that statute says that it is the bishop's privilege to choose whether he's going to report or whether he is not. And it also specifically says that if a person in the bishop's position does report it to law enforcement, that person is not subject to a lawsuit by the perpetrator for false reporting or anything else, right? Because they do sue.
As long as it is a good faith reporting, there's an absolute immunity from civil and criminal liability. That's absolutely correct.
And if a guy confesses it to you, it's good faith reporting, okay? If a guy tells you he's molesting his daughter, you can believe him. Even in Arizona, it's a good faith basis. And the good faith basis is there to keep people from using it to harass or harm people who are innocent. But you're right. So he's got complete immunity because this guy confessed to him. The bishop has complete immunity to call the police, pick up 911, call the cops on this guy. But instead, he calls the helpline and talks to this attorney in Salt Lake City representing the church, who looks at the statute and tells him instead that the Arizona law says that you cannot report this to the police. Lie. And if you do report it to police, we will not stand behind you in the eventuality that you get sued. You will stand alone and have to bear your own attorney's fees.
Right. And to your point that was a lie, I want to also highlight there are some legal questions which really depend on the operation of state law. And this is one of them, right? So if we look at this, the purpose that the church has on this right-hand side column, where in the press release is talking about the purpose of this helpline, part of this is true, where they're talking about complying with the various laws of child abuse in all 50 states. But let me tell you, there is not one single state where you are prohibited from making a report like Merrill Nelson told the bishops involved in this case. And that's why it is so obviously a lie, because it's not one of these questions that, well, let me look at the statute and get back to you, like I have to do at work or like you've had to do in your past being an attorney.
I went and read the statute.
Right. I did too. Yep. And
that's how I know what it says.
But my point is, even beyond just like, I need to go look at this statute, there's not a single state where what Merrill Nelson said is true.
Yeah, he should be disbarred and hung up for the crows to feed on his corpse. That's just my feeling about you, Meryl. Nothing personal. Okay. Did you want to say anything about this slide more?
The last one I wanted to, I'm not going to highlight number 2, but number 3 says that its purpose, the purpose of this helpline, is directly report the abuse to authorities, regardless of legal exemptions from reporting requirements, when it is known that a child is in imminent danger. How whoever wrote that got away with not just collapsing under the weight of their own hypocrisy is beyond me. Because if these children were not in imminent danger, I don't know what imminent danger looks like.
So to put this in context, going up to the top, it's talking about the church's helpline. Has been in existence for more than a quarter of a century. Its purpose is to, go down to 3, directly report the abuse to authorities. That's not what happened here. It was the opposite. And the purpose of the helpline is to, regardless of legal exemptions from reporting requirements, when it is known that a child is in imminent danger. Was this kid not in imminent danger?
Well, let's listen to what the sentencing judge, Eliza Adams' sentencing, had to say about how imminent the danger was and how involved the church was. So this is, again, Paul committed suicide in prison.
Yeah.
Liza, then the
awaiting
wife.
trial.
Awaiting trial.
Yes.
Liza, then the wife, who is obviously not right in the head also, her involvement.
And this happens more often than you might think, by the way. Women standing by their men, even in these kind of circumstances. It's astonishing, but I've seen it. It's true. It does happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely it happens. Because oftentimes people who are sexual abusers are abusers in many different flavors and many different ways. So oftentimes those spouses are also very abused people that may not fully have their full normal capacity, is all I want to say. Mm-hmm. But here's what the judge who sentenced Liza Adams, after hearing her involvement in this entire abuse situation, said at Liza's sentencing. I've read this before, but I think it is so powerful that I'd be remiss if I didn't, to drive home. If this wasn't imminent harm, then what the hell is? She said, the judge said, Miss Adams, if you had done what you should have done and could have done back in either 2010 or 11, it's a little unclear to me whether it was the one year or the other year, when you first learned for a certainty what your then husband had done with M1, your older daughter. That's just, M1 is they're protecting the minor child's name. M1, your older daughter, if you had called the police, I didn't hear from the bishop directly. He wasn't here to testify. I'm hesitant to make judgments or pronouncements about his situation when I haven't heard it directly from him. But I will say, had he called the police or taken some other action rather than apparently acted out of some hope, rather than out of some sense of responsibility for these children, had he done something, had you done something, Miss Adams, back in 2010 or 2011, these crimes wouldn't have happened. Count 1 happened in June 2015.
And by the way, I'm so sorry.
Yes.
In between the lines is, and by the way, you wouldn't be standing in front of me being sentenced right now if you had done something about it. Or even if the bishop had, because she learns about it when the bishop on the second visit has Adams confessed to his wife. That's probably the first time we could nail down that she knows about it.
Although if you look at what
about it before.
If you look at what the judge is saying here, it may have dated back to 2010. I'm pretty sure from my recollection of the facts of this case that she knew about this, or at the very least should have known before late 2011, because that's when that conversation with Bishop Herod took place.
Right. But if you peg it there, right? If that's the only time you can actually prove it, then if he had reported or if she had reported, then she wouldn't be standing there.
Right.
Being convicted of this crime and being sentenced and having these words addressed to her is all I'm saying.
Right. So count 1, going back to I think it was going back to her statements on the record. Count 1 happened in June 2015. Count 2 happened somewhere from between or within the time span of March 29th, 2015 through February 8th, 2017. Those things wouldn't have happened if, when the bishop called you in here, quote, listen to what Paul is telling you about raping your, at that time, only daughter, if you had done something, if the bishop had done something, if someone had acted out of a sense to help these children and not worrying about, am I going to get in a problem with the church or things along those lines, whatever people were thinking, If people were acting out of a sense of responsibility for these children, then these two crimes wouldn't have happened at all. Against the older child, M1 would have still been the victim of Mr. Adams' conduct up to that point, but it wouldn't have continued, and it wouldn't have continued for years, and M2 wouldn't have been victimized at all because she hadn't been yet born. But she wasn't protected. She wasn't protected by you. She wasn't protected by the bishop. She wasn't protected, certainly not by her father. She wasn't protected by anybody. And my point with this is, remember what they said about this helpline. The priority of this helpline is to help protect children. It has everything to do with protecting children. Bullshit. Read this statement and tell me that the church's helpline had everything to do with protecting children. It's impossible to square these two. Period. End of story.
Good point. This certainly gives the lie to their protestations of innocence. And then I think we went to this page, and this is the next text. This is also from the judge's order.
This is actually from myself.
Okay, so these are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to share these to basically say, I recognize that the law as it stands in Arizona and Idaho and Utah, shocker, those three are united on this, gives the church the ability to decide not to report child abuse in certain situations. I am frustrated with that policy decision, and I have a typo there, I aim to take sincere efforts to change it in my state during the next legislative session. Well, you can guess how well that went over in a legislature completely dominated by LDS church influence.
What did you try and do?
I tried to get a bill. I wrote a bill and tried to get a bill through to the legislature, and I wasn't even given even a cursory time of day.
What was the bill about? I know it was generally about. What did it say?
It was trying to bring clarity to the mandatory reporting exemptions.
Okay. And does that mean in cases of child sex abuse, it's mandatory reporting, to carve out a special exception for that?
Yep.
Okay. Go ahead, please. Sorry to interrupt.
I then said, I'm frustrated by the church's bewildering policy decision to use these exemptions not to report. I literally cannot wrap my head around it, even as a lawyer who understands the potential institutional liability at stake. But most of all, I'm frustrated by their blatant dishonesty. The church claims every time one of these cases comes to light that abuse of any kind is not tolerated in the church, when that is an obvious and blatant lie. You do not get to eat your cake and also have it on this issue. If there is more that could be done to tolerate abuse within the church less, which there obviously is, you do not get to claim that you do not tolerate abuse. And then I have edited to add to this post. This was back to that original Reddit post I wrote that is the most shared thing I've ever written on Reddit. And Nemo the Mormon made this suggested edit. He suggested I add something to this effect. It is important to remember the church's spokesperson's statement regarding the dismissal, again, pending appeal, of this Bisby case, namely that the church is pleased with the result. You cannot be both pleased. Honestly, that word choice is despicable. Where do they find these ghouls? This is the same active member that called the lawsuit a money grab by the children too. You cannot... that parenthetical was way too long. You cannot be both pleased that abuse continued for an additional amount of years due to your not reporting, and honestly claim to prioritize the interest of victims. To just head off a very common and misguided apologetic I hear a lot on this topic. Some say, but if clergy penitent privilege is an absolute, then people won't confess the abuse. We saw that very apologetic by Jennifer Roach, recycled by Austin Fife earlier in today's episode. In cases like this, where the abuse is confessed and nothing is done, then what is the difference? There isn't one, except the survivor also gets to deal with the secondary trauma of finding out that their religious leaders knew about their abuse and did nothing that would end it by exercising an option not to report. Your thoughts?
Yeah, he's a trenchant fellow, that Nemo. On the other hand, and I get it, looking from the victim's perspective, absolutely. The argument from the other side is, if you have a place where a person can confess a sin without being reported to the police, they're more likely to confess and then hopefully work with the bishop in doing something to make things better. In this case, this guy wouldn't do anything, it looks like.
Right.
He wouldn't do anything that the bishop suggested. So it's a very, very difficult issue, but I think we got to look at the kids, right? They've got to be the focus. They've got to be put foremost, and their welfare, and keeping kids from being abused, and keeping kids who are abused from continuing to be abused. Somebody's got to stand up for the kids at some point. Somebody's got to act responsibly and not just hope that things will get better, when everything we know about the subject tells us it's not going to get better on its own.
Mm-hmm.
He's not going to repent of it and stop doing it. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, and just to drive the point home, if you'll go to the last slide, then I think we're done with the Adams case.
Okay.
So again, here's that statement from abuse, and I just want to contrast it with what the judge said. No one affiliated with the church reported Mr. Adams' conduct to law enforcement. Mr. Adams continued to abuse plaintiffs after his confession to Herod and after he was excommunicated. Miss Adams and the children remained active in the church after Mr. Adams was excommunicated. Mr. Adams continued to reside with Miss Adams and their two daughters after the confession and excommunication. My point with this is just, if we're looking at what the church says, which is that it does not tolerate abuse in any form, I maintain that that statement alone is a demonstrable lie based on this case and other cases. You can't simultaneously claim that you don't tolerate abuse and then stipulate to a set of facts or not contest a set of facts that says you didn't do anything about this for 7 years.
Right. And this isn't one of those situations where they get to point at the ward members and the bishop and make him take the fall, because he's doing it on his own, because he actually called the helpline and did what he was told to do by the lawyer in Salt Lake City.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was put there by the church for that purpose. So, yeah, you can't just blame it on the bishop. So they're going to minimize and do everything they can, and they're actually going to lie to you about what really happened in the case. They're going to lie to you about the facts they stipulated to in the case that shows, no, they don't prioritize protecting children.
Exactly. My second example was, of course, the local example that I saw. So this is in our local paper here in the Boise area, the Idaho Statesman. And the LDS bishop was removed from his Idaho post. He faces multiple sexual abuse charges. This was reported on September 15th, 2021. And I wanted really to just have this statement from the church in response to this, being publicized. Would you read that statement there that I've snipped?
So there's another incident, another story, and another statement by the church in response to this story.
So this is the local reporting on the story I was personally involved with.
Thank you. Okay. So this is from the story. Upon learning of these allegations in early January 2021, church officials immediately took steps to remove this individual from his lay leadership position in the church. Sam Penrod, a spokesperson for the church in Salt Lake City, said in a statement emailed to the Idaho Statesman. So now, this quotation is from the church. It's an official statement by the church, by their spokesperson, Sam Penrod. Upon learning of these allegations in early January, church officials immediately took steps to remove this individual, the bishop, from his lay leadership position in the church. Make it sound as meaningless as possible. Lay leadership. It's a bishop. He's the father of the ward. It's like a priest in the Catholic Church. Abuse of any kind, the church statement goes on. Abuse of any kind is not tolerated in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Yes, it is. It's actually almost, I won't say it's encouraged, but the field is it's fertilized. The dinner bell is out there. Everything is made welcome and warm and comfortable for the child molester in the LDS church. It is a place, it's a target-rich environment for a child molester. And yet they say it's not tolerated. Anyone who engages in such behavior is rightfully subject to criminal prosecution. Well, if you can get a bishop to call, I guess, to call the cops, or a lawyer in Salt Lake to tell them to do so. Anyone who engages in such behavior is rightfully subject to criminal prosecution. I'm sorry, that's not the full sentence, but I'm going to stop there, because what are they not saying there? And what is it they're intentionally hiding and trying to give the impression of without saying?
Yeah, they're trying to look like they make the report or that they work with local law enforcement officials to hold these people accountable. This is the thing. When you start to see it in the church's public facing communication,
Mm-hmm.
they are masterful at being incredibly misleading while never, well, I won't say never, with
Yes.
rarely directly lying. So they're trying to give the reader of this statement the impression that they stand against abuse, that they work against abuse, and we're going to contrast that with what actually happened here in just a minute. But
All right. I'll read the whole sentence. Anyone who engages in such behavior is rightfully subject to criminal prosecution and also faces discipline from the church, including loss of church membership. There's the end of the statement.
you know what's so interesting, RFM? You know what I
What?
don't see in that statement from the church?
What's that?
Anything dealing with the victims or the survivors of this person. Anything dealing with how they address this with their ward leadership. And it's possible that the statement's only snipping part of it. But again, what I'm doing on this issue is holding the church to what the church said. They said that their first priority, right? If we go back to that statement from the manual, and you don't have to, I'll just read it. But they said the first responsibility of church leaders is to help those who have been abused and to protect those who may be vulnerable to future abuse. Bullshit. If you're not going to do it, then take that off of your website talking about abuse, because this is where we see this disconnect between the aspiration or the theory and the reality in how these cases are handled. So let's talk about that reality. Will you go to the next slide? So after getting involved with this case, I have every police report and I have everything involved in this local case because...
Your case, the one that you were involved in.
Correct. And when we say my case, the one I'm involved in, that sounds a little weird. The one I observed.
Yes.
Not my case. This is from the police reports.
In your ward.
In my ward. This is from the police reports involving this person who was my bishop. And I kept the Idaho Statesman statement from the church at the top to compare and contrast. So the church talks about learning about these allegations in early January. It's kind of funny to call them allegations when the freaking abuser comes to you and confesses, and you've had conversations with the victims as well. I'm not sure I would continue to characterize those as allegations, but we'll set that aside for a second. What I have at the bottom of the screen is a portion of the police report from the officers involved in investigating that crime when this individual was arrested 3 months later. So here is my point. The church knew about this from January, and this person is not arrested and indicted until April 12th, 2021. So that's 3 years ago today that this person was charged. And you can see in the police reports the officers' concern for that reality right here.
4 years ago today, right?
4 years ago today. You're right.
But January is when the church learned of the allegations. Is that what it's saying? But they didn't do anything about it until he got arrested?
They didn't do anything about it, period. He was arrested because another member, and I'll give it to here, it was a member of our stake, but they were told not to report and did so anyways because they have a moral conscience, unlike the rest of the people who were involved who knew about this for 3 months and was allowing this person to continue accessing their own children who they'd already abused, as well as other children. I am not...
Just to be clear, because I get confused just a little bit, but I just want to be really clear. We've stopped talking about the Bisby, Arizona case.
Yes.
And now we're talking about the case in your ward in Idaho that ended up, the way it was handled, ended up with propelling you out of the church.
Correct.
Okay, so they learn about the bishop, your former bishop, and what he'd been doing, and they don't do anything. I know you say they don't do anything at all, but he ends up being arrested 3 months later on
April 12th,
2021.
He was indicted on April 12th, or I'm sorry, arraigned on April 12th. So he was actually arrested on the 11th. But
okay, but this admits basically that the church knew about it in early January. So at least 3 months, maybe a little bit more.
Yeah. And so this, what I have at the bottom half, this is from the police reports of the officers investigating this in April. I have not received any police reports or health and welfare referrals, because that's who you would call and report to if you're a mandatory reporter, is the Department of Health and Welfare here in Idaho, that indicate the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they have and Latter-day Saints, reported the sexual abuse since January 10th, 2021, when it was brought to the church's attention. Now, you know as well as I do, the officer is putting that in there probably because they're concerned about the lack of mandatory reporting, or at the very least, they're indicating like they knew about this for 3 months. That's the way I read it, at least.
Right. And there's also a bit of CYA in there, that the reason we're only getting on this 3 months later is because the church never told us.
Exactly. It then says it is unknown who specifically, and then I've redacted the individual's name, but that's the abuser, who the abuser confessed to at the church when he was removed from a position of authority in the church. In speaking with the abuser's wife, she confirmed that the church is aware of the sexual abuse at this time. So my point is this. The church says that its number one priority is the kids. That is demonstrably not true. When you have multiple cases where these people are allowed to continue to have access to children, to continue to be free, when the church knows that they're abusers, according to them, that they told the church. This is just so egregious that I just can't even believe it.
So my understanding is it is unknown who specific. They must have figured it out later, but at the time they're writing this, they don't even know who the bishop is that this guy confessed to.
Yeah, and it would have been the stake president, but they don't
Because
understand
he's a bishop.
that. Yeah.
So bishops confess to the stake president.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They're not exactly open and transparent in the Mormon Church, are they?
No. And since it was the stake president that this individual confessed to, I pulled a brief clip from the way, since it was more contemporaneous, I pulled a brief clip from our episode on Mormon Stories where I talk about this conversation with this stake president about this issue.
Okay, well, we'll leave that as the intro. I'm going to have to go over here to a separate thing. I'll get it so I can play it. I didn't
35.
realize that was a. Are you already there?
I always have the slides open on another tab.
Well, I guess you're really smart, aren't you? Yeah, I saw you there. So let me go ahead and we'll what I'll do is I'll take this down from here. I'm going to share the screen now. Bada bing, bada bang. Let me see your view. If I do mode. Nope. See, if I do the whole thing, that the problem is, no, that's going to work. Brilliant. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to put that up. Now let's make sure this works. I think that's mine. No, this is mine. Hang on, let me take yours down. I think that was yours. This is mine. Okay.
Story. I did not go and ask whether or not the ex-bishop was called of God, because I already knew that the God I believed in would not put a child molester in those rooms with bishops or with children and put children at risk. I did not believe that. I did not ask that question because I didn't want the answer, or I didn't want to hear his answer, frankly. Enough people had come and talked to him concerned about the situation that he volunteered the answer anyways, which was also very horrifying. He said, and I was alone at this
because he would have called the original bishop.
He called this bishop, yes. And he told me that he wanted to testify that the Lord had called this bishop and that sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways.
He bore, your stake president bore testimony to you that God chose that child molester to be a bishop because the Lord works in mysterious ways.
Yeah, and I want to be really clear. I do not expect perfection of church leaders. if this stake president would have just told me, I had a feeling, because we know that's how the Spirit works. I had a feeling and I felt like I was doing what was right, but truthfully, I don't know. I would have probably dropped at least this part of the story, but that is so damaging. I mean, I can't imagine putting myself in the shoes of those victims and knowing that they were abused, that the person who called the abuser points the finger right at God rather than just admit, I may have made a mistake.
Wow. Well, I'm kind of surprised, because even saying what you were going to give grace to the stake president if he had said that I had a feeling and maybe I made a mistake. I mean, no, obviously you made a mistake. Hello, stake president. This isn't even a question. But you were nice enough to say, if he had just admitted maybe a little accountability here, stake president, maybe you were somewhat responsible for putting this guy in the place he was in so he could molest children.
Yeah. But this institution cannot be accountable for anything. I shared this in that episode, but my last time attending Mormon services, because I refuse. I'm not taking my children to this organization. I know people have different approaches to that, and I'm not saying that my approach is the only right one. But where I'm at is Cammie and I refuse to associate with anything associated with the church, any activity. And the reason is because as an institution, it is unhealthy and it is unwell in that it has a culture that does not allow people to take any accountability because of its claims, because of that pedestal that Elsie was talking about. So I really just wanted to share that to compare and contrast what the church says it does versus what the church actually does when you live through an experience like this. I wanted to then end by talking about some of the questions Austin should have asked, rather than do this weird fallacious game that he's playing where he's got to end right back where he started and never left ever anyways. Which is the truth. I would ask these three.
The church is the place he never left, but ends up back anyway. Yeah.
Right. I would ask these three questions instead. Have the church's policies or leadership structures ever enabled the covering up of abuse? And if so, what systemic changes would accountability require? And the reason I would change that question to the questions Austin asked is this will shift the question from comparative safety, pretending that if other people are worse, then we have no changes to make, to an institutional responsibility approach, centering the church's role in suppressing, often, not just preventing potential abuse. My second question would be, how can we claim abuse is not tolerated in any form when documented cases show bishops were counseled to not report abuse to civil authorities? Rather than defend general principles, this question would force direct engagement with the issue of practice over policy, highlighting the gap between written handbooks and policy statements and real-world actions and effects. And my third question would be, if the church is so confident that its system works, why not advocate for full transparency? Publish these abuse statistics, publish hotline logs, and publish bishop training content.
Instead of making sure that all the notes that are taken by the people on the other end of this helpline destroy all their notes at the end of each day.
Exactly. This calls the church's bluff on its confidence. If the system is truly exceptional, transparency would enforce trust, not threaten it. Silence, opacity, and legal positioning it takes in court suggest otherwise.
Wow.
I then wanted to share, if it's okay, I wanted to share my 3 policy change suggestions. These were the things that were so offensive to the folks in Salt Lake that we got the blow-off letter. I won't read them in their entirety, but I'll just kind of summarize them.
Are these they?
These are them. These are they, I should say.
Thank you. Actually, my mother thanks you.
Yeah. Would you mind actually just reading the first, and then I'll...
Sure. So this is the first suggestion you made in your letter to Salt Lake City with the approval and request of your area president, that you got a blow-off letter back from Salt Lake like 2 days before the news broke about the Bisby case.
Correct.
When any church leader is charged with child sex abuse crimes, the church must release the leader and notify the parents of any children that this leader has had stewardship over. This notification need only include the charges that have been filed to protect the identities of victims, but also give parents the ability to consult with their kids regarding any potential further abuse or any inappropriate behaviors from this leader. This notification should be provided in writing to ensure that individuals not in attendance on any particular day have received this information. That seems reasonable and straightforward, Colby, to me.
Well, apparently it was a bridge too far for Salt Lake. Number two.
But you don't have everybody there at church every week. Usually you'll be there as a faithful Mormon, but there's vacations, there's things that happens, people can get sick. If you're not there when they make the announcement, put it in writing, make sure everybody gets it. Even King Benjamin knew that much.
Right. And conditioning it based on someone being charged means that at least a judge has heard the evidence against this person and decided that it's more probable than not to avoid, just rumor or an allegation ruining someone's life. I'm conditioning it specifically off the state filing charges based on a warrant.
And I imagine that any such statement from the church would include the fact that this is a charge and it's not, he hasn't been convicted, but we want to make sure everybody knows because, you should know.
Right. My second suggestion was regardless of any exemption from mandatory reporting laws, the church will report instances of abuse to the appropriate legal authorities and cease trying to handle these matters in-house. Exemptions from mandatory reporting laws do not silence church leaders, even though we have been told that they do incorrectly multiple times. That was, again, part of our experience was exactly like what happened in the Bisby case, where our stake president was told he couldn't report. The Idaho law prohibited him from reporting, which is not the truth. Back to the suggestion, it says these mandatory reporting exemptions simply provide an exemption from the requirement to report. In other words, laws that excuse clergy from the requirement to report alone do not mean that clergy members cannot speak to officials.
Right.
The church will cease doing the minimal amount required by the law to protect children facing abuse. And again, as I suggested earlier in the podcast, if the church just changed its policy and made clear that our policy on these particular crimes is we report abuse every single time, these individuals would have no reasonable expectation of privacy in that communication, and they would know that the church is not a place that tolerates abuse.
Okay. And then the third one, yearly training, not just every 3 years with a 30-minute cartoon video. Yearly training for all adults regarding the signs of child sex abuse, which, by the way, famously include being withdrawn, also acting out in sexually inappropriate ways, grooming behaviors, and how to deal with survivors of sexual abuse. This should include the professional expertise of the church's counselors and awareness of the statistics of how common sexual abuse is and ways to guard against it. The church should offer professional expertise through counselors, not just priesthood leaders. We're talking about counselors who know what they're doing. They counsel people for a living in these situations, not a bishop's counselor. For parents and youth, if they need help starting the discussion. So here you're focusing on the victims.
Right. The way the church says that they do.
Yeah. But you have to suggest it because they're obviously not doing what they say they're doing.
Right.
And focusing on the victims. So have some resources there that victims can access. Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. And we've shared a number of other good ideas, but I just thought for context, I would share what I sent to Salt Lake at the time, because those to me were the three most pressing and also, frankly, the three most common sense things I think the church could do on this issue.
So do you have the blow-off letter? You didn't include the blow-off letter?
I do have the blow-off letter. Do you want me to share it? Let me find it.
Yeah. We'll do the blow-off letter as our concluding thoughts.
I actually wrote a letter to Austin about concluding thoughts.
You wrote a letter to Austin about concluding thoughts? Holy crap. That's going to be the end of the show. We'll let you read the letter. We'll go dark, and then Austin can just sit and chew on it for a while.
Okay.
But first, the blow-off letter.
Okay, first the blow-off letter.
When you make these three completely reasonable suggestions to the church leadership in Salt Lake about what they could do to better protect children the Mormon children that are going to the Mormon Church. I want to hear what they had to say in response. And once again, you get this letter from them 2 days before the Bisby case breaks.
Correct.
And I'm guessing that that's really going to highlight the difference between what the church says and what the church does in relation to protecting kids.
Do you have share screen turned on? Yes, you do.
Well, that's an accident.
I think that I have to drag it up, right? Or maybe you have to drag it up.
I don't even know, but let's see. If I add that, okay, I'm going to take this off. We'll put this up. Hello.
Perfect.
Now, if I were Bill Reel, I'd know how to make this, to enlarge it. He's good at making things bigger. He showed me last night on the show. Get your mind out of the gutter.
Okay. So
Please.
I want to highlight one thing before I read the substance of this letter. And the first is that this letter is dated June 22nd, 2022, but it was not received by us in near Boise until late July, like I said. The funny thing about that is that I texted, so we had sent our letter like several months before. I had texted our stake president for an update and was frustrated that it was taking so long to hear back from Salt Lake. Within 2 days, or maybe 3 days, I received this letter in the mailbox, but it was dated like to a month before it was received. So,
are you saying you suggest it was backdated?
I am going to suggest that, yes.
Okay,
it's not like this church has a history of backdating things anyways.
Including First Vision accounts and priesthood restorations.
Yeah.
So we've got June 22nd, 2022 is the date on the letter which you received a month later at the end of July 2022 in response to your letter that you wrote to the church with your suggestions.
Yes. And I remember the date in particular because it was my daughter's birthday, for what it's worth. Okay. I have been asked by the office of the First Presidency to respond to your recent letter to President Russell M. Nelson.
Who's writing this?
This is the Commissioner of LDS Family Services. I've redacted off her name, but that was mostly because Reddit prohibits doxing people. So,
okay, so you write to the leaders and you get this response from a hack. In other words, the leaders say, "Hey, you hack, respond to this."
Yes, and it's important to remember, and I shared this earlier, but the area president, I remember specifically him saying that this letter was expected for at the highest levels of the church. So then to receive a letter back from, no offense to the individual, but from a toady, not from the highest levels of the church, really suggested how seriously they took it, and I think demonstrated that he was lying all along. But
hack toady, this person can't take offense at anything we're saying.
That's right.
But what do they say?
Okay, so they continue and say, I appreciate your willingness to share your thoughts and suggestions. Your letter has been carefully examined by professionals with expertise in responding to child abuse under my direction. Sorry, not discretion. My team at Family Services are intimately involved in the review and establishment of church policy. We are always available to help victims of abuse and their family and to advise ecclesiastical leaders. It's funny how they reverse those every time they're talking to someone who's concerned about victims, huh? As you appropriately noted, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints maintains that abuse cannot be tolerated in any form. Those who abuse their spouses, children, and other family members or anyone else violate the laws of God and man. Additionally, pursuant to church policy, we follow the law in reporting abuse and never opt to handle abuse matters in-house rather than to report it.
Wait a second. What did you think when you read that lie? That's a lie, and we've gone over why it's a lie. What did you respond?
I literally watched it with my own freaking eyes. Like, that's the thing about the church, man. The church gets so Orwellian when you really dig down on something that it's amazing. It's, to quote that, you've told this story before, like, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? And that's how I felt. Like, this person is telling me, because remember, I had those suggestions and about a page of introduction to tell them, like, why we cared about this issue.
Yes.
And it's basically,
so tell me you didn't read my letter without telling me you didn't read my letter.
Yeah, it's basically, or it's saying, like, I just don't believe anything you said, basically.
Yes.
They then said it is church policy to maintain our distance from a situation when civil authorities are investigating. Moreover, the church provides extensive training materials, including online instruction for local priesthood and organization leaders and others who work with children. What do you think of those extensive training materials, RFM?
I think they're inadequate, but she's throwing them out there as an excuse for not giving you the time of day on any of your suggestions. We're already doing everything perfectly. We don't need any stinking suggestions from Idaho, Colby.
Mm-hmm. It then continues, where warranted, leaders provide notice to ward members. In this case, however, the mother of the victims requested that their abuse not be publicized in the ward. Here, the abuse at issue occurred within the family, and the perpetrator's membership record had been withdrawn, making him ineligible to serve with youth. Accordingly, local leaders wisely decided to honor the mother's request. Say, RFM, did any of what I asked for say publicize the details of the abuse victim's story?
Nope, it's a straw man.
Yep.
It's a total straw man. And it's also saying that the mother, even if you believe this, it's saying that the mother of the victim gets to decide whether any other children in the ward and their parents are notified.
Yeah, how well would that have worked in the situation involving Liza Adams? Right? This is exactly the problem.
Right.
You can't trust the people intimately involved in a situation to make the right decision all of the time. The letter then concludes by saying, if you have further concerns, we encourage you to work with your stake president and other local leaders. We are confident that they have your best interests at heart and it can help resolve any additional concerns.
Big blow off. They can't do anything. That's why you're writing them in the first place.
Again, at the local leaders' direction to do that.
So that must have been frustrating for you.
Well, it's the reason I'm no longer a member, so I guess that's fair.
A birthday to remember.
Yeah. So here were my closing thoughts.
Okay, now, I don't really have a whole lot of closing thoughts, except I'm so glad that Elsie joined us. She was fantastic. And I'm just glad she had committed for 2 hours. We got her for 2 hours and 45 minutes. So I think I played that pretty well. And now we're going to conclude this discussion on Austin Fife's chapter in his Light on Truth letter about child abuse in the church. And this is your response directly to Austin, who still has an open invitation and has for months now, to come on the show and talk with some people about his Light on Truth letter if he's really interested in hearing the other side and talking with us.
Yeah, and if Austin doesn't like anything I wrote, I'll just say I'm just a guy who wrote a letter. So let me read that letter that I wrote to him now.
Take it away.
Austin, you acknowledge that abuse is real and horrifying, and I don't question your sincerity when you say your own experience in the church has been positive. But your section defending the church from accusations of systemic abuse fails in two key ways. It ignores the distinction between abuse occurring and abuse being enabled, and it treats institutional reputation management as a sufficient substitute for victim-centered reform. You ask, is abuse more likely in the church than elsewhere? But this is entirely the wrong question. The right one is, what has the church done when abuse has occurred, especially when committed by those in authority? And has it protected victims, or has it protected itself? We know the answer. In multiple cases, from the Bisby scandal to church-suppressed Boy Scout abuse settlements, leaders followed the church's own legal hotline procedures to shield abusers from criminal accountability. That's not a failure in spite of church systems. That is the system. Your reliance on Jennifer Roach's Boy Scout data is misplaced. She compares abuse rates based on a dataset that is incomplete, not peer-reviewed, and lacks context about reporting dynamics. Even then, the best she can say is, I know where I would put my kid. That's not data. That is anecdote disguised as evidence.
By the way, Colby, I'm sorry, I do have to interrupt you here. Just to explain, because we didn't get to this part of Colby's response. What he does is he cites to Jennifer Roach, who basically looks at Boy Scout data and then interprets that in terms of Mormon data, and thereby, with this questionable methodology, she comes up with this remarkably and unusually low incident rate of child molestation by Mormons on Mormon youth.
Yes, thank you for that context. I then say, and finally, when you say critics pretend strengths are weaknesses, you overlook that those strengths, like worthiness interviews and male-only leadership, are exactly the areas where abuse has flourished, precisely because they concentrate power, suppress dissent, and help keep victims silent. If the church is serious about its claim that abuse cannot be tolerated in any form, then it must do more than publish handbooks and compare itself favorably to public schools. It must tell the truth about its failures, publish abuse reports transparently, remove institutional protections for predators, and let civil authorities, not attorneys in Salt Lake, take the lead. Good people can be wrong, and good institutions can cause immense harm if their survival becomes more important than their integrity. The church's doctrine may condemn abuse, but its actions and its inactions have tolerated it extensively.
So well put. Thank you so much, Colby, for reading that for our audience and for responding to Austin. Austin, if you want to respond to that, come on the show. Just contact me at radiofreemormon1, the number 1, at gmail.com. That's radiofreemormon1 at gmail.com, and make arrangements there. We'll have you on the show as soon as we possibly can. So thank you again, Colby. Everybody out there, thanks so much for watching. Wow, we're almost at 4 hours. Is this a record for us? Have we done more than 4 hours before, Colby?
We did 4.5.
Oh, my Lord. Well, let's keep going. I kid. So we're going to cut here at 4 hours. We're not going to go to 4.5 hours. We're not going to beat the record. But thanks, everybody, for watching. Please hit like. Please hit like if you haven't already. And then also the subscribe button. Please hit the subscribe button. Leave a comment below. Let us know what you thought about this show. And we will see you next time for another episode of Radio Free Mormon. Once again, Colby, thanks for joining me. Until next time, this is Radio Free Mormon, signing off the air.